The sun had just begun to stretch its golden fingers across the horizon, casting a warm glow that filled the small kitchen with a sense of promise. Tendai stood by the stove, the rhythmic sound of sizzling pancakes filling the air, blending harmoniously with the distant chirping of birds outside. It was a morning that whispered of tranquility, a sanctuary carved out of time when nothing else mattered but the simple joy of preparing breakfast for his beloved nephew Kofi. As Tendai flipped the pancakes with a practiced ease, a soft smile graced his lips. The aroma of vanilla and butter enveloped him, wrapping him in the nostalgia of childhood mornings spent in his own mother's kitchen. It was a recipe passed down through generations, each flip of the pancake a tribute to the love that had nurtured him. Memory swirled around him like the gentle steam rising from the griddle, a warm embrace of safety and comfort that shielded him from the world outside. Kofi, a sprightly 7-year-old with big, expressive eyes, darted into the kitchen, his small feet padding softly against the tiled floor. His laughter was like music, pure and untainted, as he peered over the counter, his curiosity bubbling over. Tendai looked down at him, and in that moment, his heart swelled with an indescribable affection. There was something magical about the innocence of childhood, a purity that seemed to illuminate even the darkest corners of existence. Kofi's face lit up as he caught sight of the golden pancakes, the way his eyes sparkled making Tendai feel as though the world was alive with potential. "Uncle Tendai, can I help?" Kofi asked, his voice a sweet melody that danced through the air. With a gentle chuckle, Tendai shook his head, ruffling Kofi's hair. "You can be the taste tester, my little chef. I need to make sure these are perfect for you." Kofi's laughter bubbled forth, a bright sound that filled the room and resonated in Tendai's heart. He carefully poured a fresh batch of batter onto the hot griddle, the sound of sizzling filling the air like a warm greeting. As he worked, he cast quick glances at Kofi, who was now perched on a stool, swinging his legs with uncontainable energy, his eyes fixed eagerly on the pancakes, as if they held the secrets of the universe. Time seemed to slow in those moments, each second stretching out like the long shadows cast by the morning sun. Tendai lost himself in the routine, the familiar motions of flipping pancakes and pouring syrup becoming a dance, an intimate performance shared only with his nephew. The kitchen was their world, a sacred space where laughter was plentiful, and love was the main ingredient. Tendai felt a surge of gratitude for this simple yet profound connection, an understanding that this was what life was truly about. The table was set with care, each plate arranged just so, adorned with vibrant fruits and golden syrup. Tendai took a moment to step back, to appreciate the scene before him, a small kitchen, filled with warmth and the intoxicating aroma of breakfast, a moment suspended in time where nothing else mattered. He could feel a sense of peace enveloping him, a blanket of serenity that shielded him from the storms that raged outside their small world. As they settled down at the table, Kofi's eyes sparkled with excitement. Tendai watched as his nephew's small hands reached for a slice of pancake, the way he savored each bite, his eyes closing in blissful delight. It was a sight that tugged at Tendai's heartstrings, an unspoken bond forged through shared meals and laughter. The innocence of Kofi's enjoyment was a balm to Tendai's soul, soothing the frayed edges of his own heart. Yet beneath this idyllic scene lay an undercurrent of vulnerability. Tendai couldn't help but feel a twinge of anxiety, a whispering fear that such moments were fleeting, easily swept away by the currents of life. He glanced at Kofi, who was lost in the simple pleasure of breakfast, and he felt an overwhelming urge to protect this little sanctuary. It was as if he could sense the fragility of their happiness, the way the world outside could encroach upon their bliss at any moment. The sun continued to rise, illuminating the kitchen with a golden hue, but shadows began to stir at the edges of Tendai's thoughts. He remembered Zuri, the echoes of her laughter intertwining with his memories like vines creeping around the corners of his mind. The warmth of the moment felt as if it could shatter at any moment, the fragile glass of their happiness threatened by the shadows of the past. Yet he pushed those thoughts aside, focusing instead on Kofi's radiant smile, the sound of his laughter filling the air, drowning out the echoes of his fears. With each passing minute, Tendai clung to the hope that this morning would never end, that they could remain wrapped in this cocoon of warmth and love forever. He watched Kofi, seeing not just his nephew but a reflection of himself, a child who deserved the world untouched by pain or the harsh realities of life. Tendai wished to preserve this moment, to hold it in the palm of his hand like a fragile bird, afraid that if he loosened his grip it would take flight, leaving behind only an empty space. But life, as it often does, has a way of intruding upon serenity. The sound of the doorbell ringing sliced through the warm atmosphere, a stark reminder that their peaceful morning was about to shift. Tendai felt a jolt of unease ripple through him as he exchanged a glance with Kofi, who seemed momentarily startled, his innocence momentarily disrupted by the intrusion. Tendai forced a smile, trying to mask his apprehension, yet deep down he could feel the weight of the impending change settling heavily on his chest. In that instant, as he wiped his hands on a dish towel, the kitchen transformed from a sanctuary into a threshold. The laughter, the pancakes, the warmth, they all stood at the brink of an unknown. Tendai took a deep breath, bracing himself for whatever was about to unfold, knowing that this seemingly innocent morning could soon unravel into something entirely different, something that could forever alter the course of their lives. But for now, as Kofi giggled and reached for another pancake, Tendai held on tightly to this fleeting moment, cherishing the innocence and joy that filled their small world, knowing it was a treasure he would fight to protect, no matter what shadows lay ahead. The doorbell rang, shattering the peaceful cocoon that had enveloped Tendai and Kofi like a warm embrace. Tendai's heart skipped a beat, a ripple of unease coursing through him as he wiped his hands on a dish towel, his senses sharpening. The sound echoed in the kitchen, where the scent of pancakes still lingered in the air, rich and comforting. Yet with that single ring the warmth began to fade, replaced by a creeping chill that threaded through his chest. He glanced at Kofi, whose small face was momentarily blank, confusion etched in his wide eyes. Tendai's stomach twisted as he wondered what this uninvited presence could bring. Life had a way of intruding upon moments of joy, and the thought unsettled him. Kofi had already been through too much for someone so young, and Tendai felt an instinctive need to protect him from whatever darkness might come knocking at their door. Taking a deep breath, Tendai walked to the entrance, his footsteps heavy, as if each step were laden with the weight of the world. The soft patter of Kofi's feet followed him, the boy's curiosity overcoming his initial surprise. Tendai opened the door, and there she stood, Zuri. Time seemed to still as he took in her figure, framed by the soft morning light that spilled around her like an aura. She appeared ethereal, yet something darker lurked in her eyes, a storm concealed beneath her striking beauty. Her hair fell in loose waves around her shoulders, catching the light in a way that made it glisten. Tendai felt his heart lurch, a mix of joy and dread swelling within him. Memories rushed back like a flood, memories of laughter and whispered secrets shared beneath the stars, intertwined with the pain of a love lost and a friendship strained. Zuri. Tendai breathed, the name barely escaping his lips. It felt like a prayer, a call to something that had once been precious, now laced with uncertainty. She offered a small smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. Instead, they flickered with something unnameable, a depth that hinted at struggles he couldn't fathom. The moment stretched, taut with unspoken words and unresolved feelings. Tendai felt the warmth of the kitchen behind him, a stark contrast to the chill that seeped into the air. He stepped aside, inviting her in, though a part of him hesitated. This was a sanctuary, a place where innocence reigned, and he feared what she might bring with her. Kofi peeked around Tendai's legs, his innocent curiosity drawing him closer to the enigmatic woman. Tendai watched as Zuri's gaze fell upon the boy, a fleeting glimmer of warmth softening her expression. She knelt down, extending her arms, but Kofi, sensing the tension, took a cautious step back, his instincts honed to protect the fragile peace that had enveloped them. As Zuri straightened, a shadow passed over her face, and Tendai felt the air grow heavy. She walked further into the kitchen, the sunlight illuminating her features in a way that both captivated and terrified him. The warmth that had filled the room moments ago seemed to retreat, leaving behind a stark emptiness that echoed in Tendai's heart. They stood in the kitchen together, an unspoken weight settling between them. Tendai moved toward the table, his fingers brushing against the plates, the remnants of their breakfast a stark reminder of the laughter that had just danced through the air. He caught Zuri's gaze, and in that instant, the world around them faded. It was just the two of them, suspended in a moment that felt both familiar and foreign. Kofi resumed his seat at the table, a small figure trying to make sense of the adult emotions swirling around him. Tendai felt the boy's eyes dart back and forth between them, a silent observer trying to decode the tension. Zuri's presence was a puzzle he had yet to solve, and he could sense Kofi's unease, a reflection of his own. Zuri's voice finally broke the silence, but it was soft, fragile, almost as if the words might shatter the delicate equilibrium of the moment. Tendai strained to hear, but the heaviness of the air seemed to muffle her sound. She spoke of mundane things, the weather, the beauty of the day, yet the darkness in her eyes spoke of deeper troubles, words unvoiced that lingered just beneath the surface. Tendai found himself drawn to her, an invisible thread pulling him closer despite the warning bells ringing in his mind. There was a magnetism to Zuri, an allure that had always held him captive, but now it felt dangerous, a fire that could consume everything in its path. As he watched her, he couldn't help but feel the weight of their shared history pressing down upon them, each memory a ghost lurking in the shadows. Her laughter, once so bright and carefree, now held an edge of desperation, a tremor that sent shivers down his spine. Tendai's heart ached with the realization that the woman before him was not the same person he had once known. She wore her pain like a shroud, a haunting reminder of the darkness that had crept into her life, weaving its way through her laughter and stealing the joy from her smile. With every passing moment, Tendai's mind raced, searching for a way to bridge the chasm that had grown between them. He wanted to reach out, to pull her back from the brink, but he felt paralyzed, caught between the past and the present. The memories they shared were both a comfort and a curse, a reminder of what had been lost. Zuri turned her gaze to Kofi, her expression softening as she watched the boy attempt to find solace in his pancakes. Tendai could see the flicker of longing in her eyes, a desire to connect, to reclaim a semblance of the warmth that once bound them. Yet it was fleeting, overshadowed by an ever-present darkness that seemed to gnaw at the edges of her spirit. Tendai took a step closer, trying to bridge the emotional distance. He sensed that Zuri needed something from him, a lifeline thrown into the turbulent sea of her existence. But what could he offer her? He felt inadequate, a mere shadow of the man she once knew, grappling with his own fears and uncertainties. As the tension in the room grew, Tendai felt the weight of the world pressing down upon him. The laughter and love that had filled their home began to feel like a distant memory, eclipsed by the storm brewing within Zuri. He knew that her arrival was not just a casual visit, it was a reckoning, a confrontation with the past that would either heal or shatter the fragile bonds they still held. The moments stretched, and Tendai could feel the air thickening with unspoken words, the kind that hung heavy on the tongue, begging to be released. He looked into Zuri's eyes, searching for the girl he had once known, the one who had shared her dreams and fears under the stars. Yet all he found was a tempest, swirling with pain and longing, threatening to consume them both. Suddenly Kofi broke the silence, his small voice cutting through the tension like a knife. "Auntie Zuri, do you want some pancakes?" The innocence in his question struck Tendai like a physical blow, reminding him of the childlike joy that was still untouched by the turmoil around them. Zuri hesitated, her expression shifting as she looked at Kofi. Tendai could see the internal battle raging within her, a struggle to maintain composure while her world threatened to unravel. For a brief moment, a flicker of warmth ignited in her eyes as she regarded the boy, a reminder of the happiness she once radiated. But just as quickly, the darkness returned, shrouding her features in a veil of sorrow. She shook her head, a sad smile barely forming on her lips, and Tendai felt his heart clench. How cruel it was, this juxtaposition of innocence and despair, a reminder that joy could exist alongside pain, that they could coexist in a world that seemed intent on tearing them apart. Tendai looked away, unable to bear the sight of Zuri's struggle, the depth of her pain sinking into him like a stone. He felt helpless, caught in the tide of emotion that surged around them, dragging him down into the depths of uncertainty. In that moment, the sanctuary they had built began to crumble, the walls of their safe haven cracking under the weight of unspoken truths and unresolved feelings. The warmth of the morning faded further, replaced by an unsettling chill that crept into his bones. Tendai knew that whatever had brought Zuri to their door was far more complicated than a simple visit. She was a storm on the horizon, and he could feel the winds shifting, the atmosphere charged with tension and unfulfilled longing. As he stood there, caught in the web of memories and emotions, Tendai couldn't help but wonder how this unexpected visitor would reshape their lives. Would she bring them together or tear them apart? In the silence that followed, he realized that the answers lay somewhere in the depths of their shared history, a story waiting to unfold in the most unexpected of ways. The atmosphere in the kitchen shifted subtly but palpably, like the first tremors before an earthquake. Tendai watched Zuri as she stood there, her beauty still striking yet clouded by an unsettling air. The warm sunlight that had once enveloped them now felt harsh, revealing the shadows lurking just beneath the surface. Tendai felt a tightening in his chest, a growing unease as he sensed that the joyful morning they had shared was slipping away, swallowed by an encroaching darkness. Zuri's laughter, once so infectious, now seemed strained. She fidgeted with her hair, twisting the strands around her fingers as if seeking comfort in their familiar texture. Tendai observed her closely, the way her eyes darted around the kitchen, catching glimpses of the ordinary Kofi's bright crayons strewn across the table, the half-eaten pancakes, the sunlight filtering through the window. Yet there was a heaviness to her gaze, a weight that anchored her spirit, pulling her down into a place from which she might not return. Kofi, caught in the tension that crackled like static in the air, shifted in his seat, his small frame appearing even more fragile amid the growing storm. Tendai's heart ached at the sight of his nephew's innocence standing in stark contrast to the turmoil unfolding before them. Kofi picked at his pancakes, his bright eyes flickering between Tendai and Zuri, confusion evident in his furrowed brow. Tendai wished desperately that he could shield the boy from the darkness that was intruding upon their safe haven, but he felt paralyzed, helpless to alter the course of the moment. Zuri's smile faltered as she caught Kofi's gaze, and for a brief instant, the facade of lightness cracked. Tendai saw a flicker of vulnerability pass through her, a glimpse of the girl he had once known full of laughter, dreams, and warmth. But that warmth was now eclipsed by an unsettling shadow that loomed in the corners of her eyes, threatening to consume her. The change was subtle but undeniable, a tide pulling her deeper into unknown waters, and Tendai could feel the current of her turmoil washing over him. As the silence stretched, Tendai's mind raced. He yearned to reach out to Zuri, to bridge the chasm that had opened between them, but he felt an invisible barrier between their worlds. Every instinct told him to protect Kofi, to pull him away from the storm that was brewing, yet he couldn't shake the bond that still tethered him to Zuri. They were tied together by shared memories, laughter, and love that had once illuminated their lives. Now it felt as if they were drifting apart, like two ships caught in a tempest, unable to find their way back to each other. The kitchen, once filled with warmth and laughter, now felt claustrophobic, as if the walls were closing in on them. Tendai felt the weight of Zuri's unspoken pain pressing against him, suffocating in its intensity. She took a step forward, her posture wavering as she searched for the right words to bridge the distance. But when she spoke, her voice was thick with uncharacteristic anxiety, trembling as if it might shatter under the weight of her emotions. Zuri glanced toward Kofi, and for a fleeting moment the mask of strength slipped, revealing the turmoil roiling beneath. She reached out, her fingers hovering just above the table as if afraid to make contact. Tendai felt a jolt of electricity course through him at the sight, the air crackling with unfulfilled longing. The essence of their past hung in the balance, a fragile string connecting them, yet he could see her struggling against it, weighed down by fears that threatened to consume her entirely. With a deep breath, she turned her attention back to Tendai, her eyes searching his, as if he held the answers to questions she hadn't yet voiced. But instead of the comfort he wished to provide, there was an urgency in her gaze, a pleading that sent a shiver down his spine. It was as if she were on the edge of a precipice, ready to leap into the unknown, and Tendai felt the ground shift beneath him, threatening to topple him over the edge alongside her. In that moment, the past rushed back to him, a torrent of memories flooding his mind, each one laced with warmth and pain. The late-night conversations, the shared dreams, the moments of vulnerability that had drawn them together. Tendai felt the swell of nostalgia, a bittersweet ache that threatened to overwhelm him. But it was more than that, it was a warning. He realized that the Zuri standing before him was not the same girl he had known, and that realization struck him with a painful clarity. The air thickened as Zuri's demeanor shifted once more, her posture growing tense, and Tendai could almost hear the thoughts racing through her mind, a cacophony of fear and desperation. He felt the atmosphere darken, shadows creeping into the corners of their sanctuary, and the warmth that had once enveloped them now felt like a distant memory. Zuri's laughter faded into a distant echo, replaced by an unsettling silence that hung heavy in the air. Suddenly she broke eye contact, her gaze drifting to the floor, where Kofi's crayons lay scattered like fallen stars. Tendai could sense her inner turmoil, the battle raging within her, and he felt a deep sorrow for the girl who had once been so full of life and laughter. It was as if a storm had rolled in, dark and unforgiving, ready to drown out the light that had once illuminated their world. In that fragile silence, Tendai dared to hope that perhaps this was a moment of vulnerability, a crack in Zuri's armor where he could reach in and pull her back from the abyss. But as he opened his mouth to speak, the words caught in his throat, choked by the weight of his own emotions. How could he possibly convey the depths of his feelings when the very ground beneath them felt so unstable? Kofi's voice broke through the thickening tension, soft and hesitant as he reached for a crayon, breaking the spell that had held them captive. "Auntie Zuri, do you want to color with me?" The innocence in his question, a child's simple desire for connection, echoed in the air like a sweet song. Tendai felt a pang of longing for the carefree days of childhood, a world untouched by pain and heartache. Zuri looked up at Kofi, her expression softening momentarily. Tendai felt a flicker of hope ignite within him, a reminder that even amidst the chaos, there was still a chance for connection, but the moment was fleeting. Zuri's smile was a fragile mask, one that shattered as quickly as it had appeared. She shook her head, and Tendai felt the sharp sting of disappointment pierce through him. Her denial was a wall that rose between them, a barricade built on fear and uncertainty. In that instant, the weight of their unspoken words settled heavily upon them, a tangible presence that suffocated the joy that had once filled the room. Tendai could see the storm gathering in Zuri's eyes, the way they darkened with unexpressed emotions that twisted her features into a mask of anguish. He felt the pull of her pain, as if it were a tangible force drawing him closer, yet pushing him away all at once. Zuri's fingers trembled at her sides, and Tendai could sense her struggle to maintain composure. It was a desperate dance, a battle fought on the front lines of her heart, and he felt helpless in the face of it. The warmth of the morning faded further, replaced by a chill that seeped into his bones, a reminder that the light they had shared was dimming. With a sudden movement, Zuri turned away, her gaze fixing on the window, as if searching for something outside, something that might offer her solace. Tendai's heart sank, feeling the distance between them grow. The memories of laughter and love clashed against the reality of the moment, creating a cacophony of emotions that threatened to drown him. He felt lost, adrift in a sea of uncertainty, longing for a connection that seemed to slip further from his grasp. The room fell silent once more, and Tendai stood frozen, his heart pounding in his chest as he watched Zuri wrestle with her emotions. Her body shook slightly, a silent testament to the storm brewing within. Tendai wanted to reach out, to pull her back into the light, but fear held him captive, paralyzing him in place. He felt as if he was standing on the edge of a precipice, watching as the woman he had once adored slipped further away from him, her light dimming with every passing moment. In that silence, the weight of their shared history pressed down upon them, the laughter of their past replaced by the shadows of their present. Tendai could see the depth of Zuri's struggles etched into her features, the pain that had settled in the lines of her brow, the haunted look in her eyes. It was as if he were witnessing the unraveling of a tapestry woven with love and trust, threads snapping one by one until the fabric lay in tatters. Kofi, sensing the shift in the atmosphere, looked between them, confusion etched on his young face. Tendai felt a wave of protectiveness wash over him, a fierce desire to shield his nephew from the storm that was brewing. The boy had already seen too much, felt too deeply for someone so young. He couldn't bear the thought of Kofi being caught in the middle of this tempest, the innocent laughter replaced by a sadness that should never touch a child. But as Tendai looked at Zuri, he realized that she needed something from him, something he was still struggling to understand. It was as if she were calling out for help, but the words remained trapped within her, festering in the silence. The connection they once shared felt frayed, unraveling under the weight of unspoken truths and buried feelings. Tendai could feel the longing in the air, the desire for understanding that remained just out of reach. And yet, even amidst the chaos, he found himself yearning for her to break free from the bonds of her pain, to rediscover the laughter that had once defined their friendship. As he stood there, caught between the past and the present, he realized that love was not merely the absence of darkness, but the presence of light in the face of it. In that moment, Tendai understood that he would do whatever it took to help Zuri find her way back, to pull her from the shadows that threatened to engulf her. But the journey ahead would not be easy. The storm that raged within her was fierce and unforgiving, and he felt the weight of that truth settling heavily upon his shoulders. As Tendai stood in the kitchen, surrounded by memories of laughter and warmth, he felt the darkness creeping ever closer, threatening to extinguish the light that had once brought them together. And as the silence stretched on, he knew that the path before them was fraught with uncertainty, but it was a path he was willing to walk, no matter how treacherous the terrain. In the heart of that unwelcome shift, he realized that love, even when burdened by pain, held the power to heal. And it was that very power he hoped to reignite, not just for Zuri but for Kofi, for their future, a future he desperately wanted to reclaim from the shadows. The kitchen, once a sanctuary filled with warmth and laughter, now felt like a battleground, the air thick with unspoken words and unresolved tension. Tendai stood at the edge of the table, watching as Zuri's struggle unfolded before him like a tragic play, each moment drawing them deeper into a darkness that threatened to consume them. The distance between them was palpable, an invisible chasm that seemed to stretch endlessly, echoing with the memories of a love that had once burned brightly but now flickered like a dying flame. Zuri turned away from him, her back rigid, as if she were trying to shield herself from the storm raging within her. Tendai could feel her turmoil, the way it resonated in the air around them, heavy and oppressive. He longed to reach out, to comfort her, to remind her of the laughter they once shared, the dreams they had woven together under the stars. But the warmth that had defined their bond was slipping through his fingers like sand, leaving only a chilling emptiness in its wake. Kofi, oblivious to the emotional tempest swirling around him, sat at the table, diligently arranging his crayons into neat rows. Tendai glanced at the boy, his small hands moving with meticulous care, and felt a pang of sorrow pierce through him. Kofi's innocence was a stark contrast to the chaos that had invaded their lives, a reminder that the world could still hold beauty even amidst the storm. But Tendai knew that innocence was fragile, and he felt a fierce desire to protect Kofi from the shadows encroaching on their sanctuary. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating, wrapping around them like a shroud. Tendai turned his gaze back to Zuri, who stood by the window, her arms crossed tightly against her chest, as if trying to hold herself together. He watched her closely, the way her shoulders trembled slightly, a silent testimony to the emotional war raging within. Her eyes, once bright and filled with dreams, were now clouded, reflecting a darkness that Tendai found hard to bear. Each passing moment felt like a weight pressing down on his heart, suffocating in its intensity. Suddenly Zuri's breath hitched, a soft gasp that cut through the silence. Tendai felt a jolt of panic course through him, a visceral reaction to the pain he could see etched into her features. She turned slightly, her face half illuminated by the morning light, revealing the shadows beneath her eyes, remnants of sleepless nights filled with anguish. It was a look that sent a shiver down his spine, and he knew that the girl he had once adored was slipping away, lost to a darkness that seemed insatiable. Zuri's gaze drifted toward Kofi, who continued to color, blissfully unaware of the turmoil that threatened to unravel their lives. Tendai could see the flicker of longing in her eyes, a yearning for something just out of reach. But the moment was fleeting, lost in the undertow of her despair. With a sudden motion, Zuri turned her back to them again, her breath coming in shallow gasps. Tendai felt a sharp pang in his chest, the ache of helplessness washing over him like a tide, pulling him under. As the silence deepened, the tension in the room became almost unbearable. Tendai could feel the walls closing in around them, the very air thickening with unspoken fears and regrets. He knew that this moment was pivotal, that the unraveling had begun, and there would be no turning back. It was as if a dam had broken, releasing a torrent of emotions that had long been held at bay, threatening to drown them all. Tendai took a hesitant step forward, wanting desperately to reach her, to pull her back from the edge, but something held him back. He could see the fragility in her posture, the way she seemed to be teetering on the brink of an emotional precipice. The air was charged with an electricity that crackled between them, an unnameable force pulling them closer, even as fear pushed them apart. Zuri, he thought, feeling the weight of her name heavy on his heart, come back to me, but the words remained unspoken, trapped in the throes of his uncertainty. Zuri clenched her fists, her nails digging into her palms as if the pain could ground her, tether her to reality. Tendai felt an ache of sympathy for her, the struggle so vividly apparent in her body language. He wanted to take her hand, to show her that she wasn't alone in this fight, that together they could weather the storm. Yet, as he watched her, he felt a growing chasm between them, a darkness that seemed to taunt him, reminding him of the gulf that had opened since she had walked through the door. Suddenly, Zuri turned, her eyes ablaze with an intensity that took Tendai by surprise. There was a fire in her gaze, a desperation that ignited the air around them. "I can't do this anymore," the words hung heavy between them, a painful admission that sent shockwaves through the room. Tendai felt his heart lurch at the sound of her voice, thick with emotion, and he realized just how far she had slipped from the girl he had once known. The energy in the room shifted, the air growing thick with tension as the storm unleashed its fury. He saw the pain etched on her face, the vulnerability that made her beautiful and broken all at once. He felt the gravity of her words, the weight of the world resting on her shoulders. Tendai took a step closer, reaching out a hand, but she recoiled, a sharp intake of breath betraying her internal struggle. The rejection stung, a bitter taste that lingered in his mouth, and he felt the threads of their connection fraying further. The hope he had clung to began to dissipate, replaced by an overwhelming sense of loss. Kofi, sensing the shift in the atmosphere, looked up from his crayons, confusion clouding his innocent gaze. Tendai's heart broke at the sight of his nephew, so young, so untouched by the harsh realities of life, now caught in the storm that raged around him. Tendai couldn't bear the thought of Kofi being pulled into this turmoil, of his innocence being tarnished by the darkness that had descended upon them. The tension escalated, thickening until it felt suffocating. Zuri's eyes glistened with unshed tears, and Tendai could see the battle waging within her. The longing for connection warred against the weight of her fears, and he felt an overwhelming urge to reach out, to break through the barrier that separated them. But as he stood there, he felt lost, unsure of how to breach the walls she had built around her heart. Zuri turned away again, her shoulders shaking slightly as she fought against the tide of emotion threatening to consume her. Tendai could feel the crack in the dam widening, the flood of unexpressed feelings poised to burst forth. Each moment stretched into an eternity, heavy with anticipation, and Tendai felt the weight of their shared history pressing down on him, suffocating in its intensity. He wanted to shout, to scream at the darkness that had invaded their lives, to fight against the despair that threatened to engulf Zuri. But as he watched her, he realized that this was a battle she had to fight herself. He could be there to support her, to offer a hand, but ultimately she needed to find her way back to the light. Tendai took a deep breath, feeling the air fill his lungs, a moment of clarity cutting through the chaos. He thought of the laughter they had shared, the dreams they had spun together, the love that had once illuminated their lives. That love was still there, buried beneath the pain, and he knew it could be their salvation. As Zuri's breath quickened, he took another step forward, this time with purpose. The connection between them felt palpable, an invisible thread drawing him closer. He reached out, not just with his hand, but with his heart, hoping to bridge the distance that had grown between them. "I'm here, Zuri," he thought, willing her to feel his presence, to understand that she was not alone in this fight. But just as he felt the energy shift, as if the air crackled with possibility, Zuri turned sharply, her eyes filled with a whirlwind of emotions: fear, anger, and heartbreak. It was as if she were a tempest, raging against the confines of her own heart, and Tendai felt himself caught in the storm. "Why can't you see?" she whispered, the words slipping from her lips like a soft cry, laden with anguish. Why can't you understand? The vulnerability in her voice pierced through him, the rawness of her pain resonating deep within his soul. Tendai felt a deep ache in his chest, a longing to reach her, to soothe the turmoil raging inside. He wanted to tell her that he understood, that he saw her struggles, that he had fought his own demons. But the words caught in his throat, the weight of his emotions too heavy to articulate. Instead, he stood there, heart racing, feeling the gravity of the moment pressing down on him. With every passing second, Tendai felt the distance between them grow wider, the darkness swirling around them like a storm cloud ready to unleash its fury. He could see the tears glistening in Zuri's eyes, a testament to the battle she was fighting. The flicker of hope that had ignited in his chest began to flicker, threatened by the shadows that loomed around them. In a desperate bid to bridge the chasm, Tendai took a deep breath, gathering his resolve. He stepped closer, his heart pounding in his chest as he reached out, his hand trembling slightly. "Zuri, please." The plea hung in the air, thick with emotion, and he felt the power of his love for her swell within him, a force strong enough to break through the barriers. But before he could close the distance, Zuri recoiled, her eyes wide with fear. "Don't!" the word echoed in the kitchen, a desperate cry that reverberated against the walls, shattering the fragile silence. Tendai felt the sting of her rejection like a dagger to his heart, the pain radiating through him, an ache so profound it threatened to consume him. The moment stretched, the tension thickening until it was almost unbearable. Tendai watched as Zuri turned away, the storm inside her swirling violently, a tempest he couldn't penetrate. He felt the weight of her anguish pressing down on him, each heartbeat echoing the sadness that enveloped them. In that moment he realized that the unraveling was complete. The bonds they had forged were fraying, the love that had once brought them together now caught in the crossfire of their struggles. Tendai felt a profound sense of loss wash over him, a mourning for the girl he had known, the laughter that had once filled their lives now silenced by the shadows of despair. Kofi, sensing the shift in the atmosphere, looked up again, confusion clouding his innocent gaze. Tendai felt a surge of protectiveness wash over him, a fierce desire to shield his nephew from the darkness that threatened to engulf them all. He turned to Kofi, forcing a smile, a mask of strength that belied the turmoil raging within him. "Everything will be okay," he whispered, though the words felt hollow, a fragile promise that hung in the air. But as he turned back to Zuri, he realized that the darkness had taken root, and the path to healing would not come easily. Tendai felt the weight of the world pressing down on him, and he knew that the journey ahead would be fraught with uncertainty. But amidst the shadows, a flicker of hope remained, a belief that love could still conquer even the darkest of nights. As he stood there, torn between despair and hope, he resolved to fight for her, for Kofi, for the light that still flickered within them all. In the heart of the unraveling, he understood that this was not the end but merely the beginning of a new chapter, one where love would be tested but ultimately prevail, shining through the darkness and illuminating the path ahead. The storm that had gathered in the kitchen was no longer just an undercurrent. It had erupted into a full-blown tempest, tearing through the fragile remnants of peace that had once defined their sanctuary. Tendai stood rooted to the spot, his heart racing, as he watched Zuri spiral deeper into her turmoil, the shadows that enveloped her now more pronounced, more consuming. The laughter and warmth that had filled their home seemed like a distant memory, replaced by an oppressive silence that weighed heavily upon them. Zuri's body trembled slightly, and Tendai could see the strain etched across her features. She was a figure caught in the crossfire of her emotions, a beautiful soul battling an unseen enemy. The flicker of hope he had clung to began to dim, replaced by a growing sense of dread as he sensed the enormity of what she was about to reveal. It was as if the very air around them had thickened, suffocating him with anticipation and fear. He could feel the pulse of Kofi's small presence nearby, the boy now quiet, his innocence a stark contrast to the chaos unfolding. Tendai cast a quick glance at his nephew, whose wide eyes reflected the confusion that churned in his heart. Kofi was too young to understand the darkness encroaching upon their lives, yet he sensed the change, the heaviness that filled the room. Tendai felt a surge of protectiveness wash over him, a fierce determination to shield Kofi from the storm that threatened to consume them. Zuri's breath hitched, a shaky sound that echoed in the silence, pulling Tendai's attention back to her. Her gaze flickered to the floor, and in that moment he knew that she was on the precipice of something monumental. The battle within her raged like a wildfire, and he could see the flames licking at the edges of her resolve, threatening to engulf her entirely. The moment stretched, taut with tension, as Zuri's fingers clenched into fists at her sides. Tendai felt the heat radiating from her, a mix of fear and vulnerability that hung in the air, electric and charged. He wanted to reach out, to comfort her, to remind her that she wasn't alone in this fight. But the wall between them felt insurmountable, an invisible barrier built from years of unspoken pain and unresolved issues. With a sudden movement, Zuri raised her head, her eyes locking onto his. In that moment, the weight of her gaze pierced through him, raw and unguarded, filled with the desperation of a soul on the brink. Tendai felt his breath catch in his throat as he confronted the tumult within her, a maelstrom of emotions that had been buried deep for far too long. "I can't keep pretending," she whispered, her voice barely above a murmur, yet it cut through the tension like a knife. Tendai felt the weight of her words settle heavily on his shoulders, a harbinger of the revelation that was to come. The air around them felt thick with anticipation, a palpable energy that crackled as she continued, "I've been living a lie." Tendai's heart raced as he absorbed her confession. It was a simple statement, yet it resonated with the force of a hurricane. He felt the ground shift beneath him, a tectonic upheaval that threatened to swallow him whole. The shadows danced in Zuri's eyes, and he could see the fear lurking there, a darkness that seemed to wrap around her like a shroud. "I thought I could find my way back," she continued, her voice trembling as tears welled in her eyes. "But every time I try, the darkness pulls me under." The anguish in her words struck Tendai like a physical blow, reverberating through him with a depth that left him breathless. Zuri's vulnerability unfurled before him, raw and unfiltered. He saw her as a flickering flame in the dark, struggling against the suffocating weight of despair. The memories of their shared laughter, the dreams they had woven together, all crashed into him like waves, leaving him gasping for air. He felt the shadows close in around him, wrapping around his heart, squeezing until it hurt. "I can't escape it," she confessed, her voice barely a whisper, but it echoed in the silence like thunder. The tears that had threatened to spill finally broke free, cascading down her cheeks, each drop a testament to the pain she had carried for far too long. Tendai felt his own heart shatter at the sight, the pieces slicing through him like shards of glass. As Zuri continued, her words became a torrent, a deluge of emotions unleashed. "I've been so lost, Tendai. So hopeless. I don't know who I am anymore." Each admission was a dagger, piercing through the defenses he had built around his heart. Tendai wanted to reach for her, to pull her back from the edge, to tell her that she was not alone in this fight. But the enormity of her pain was overwhelming, and he felt himself drowning in it. He remembered the girl he had once known, the laughter that had danced in her eyes, the light that illuminated her spirit. And now, standing before him, was a stranger cloaked in darkness, a beautiful soul on the brink of despair. The realization that she had suffered in silence for so long shattered him, leaving him grappling with his own feelings of helplessness. Kofi stirred slightly, sensing the shift in the atmosphere. Tendai glanced at the boy, whose innocent face was painted with confusion. He felt a surge of protectiveness, a desperate need to shield Kofi from the pain unfolding before them. But he knew that the truth could not be hidden forever, and Kofi deserved to understand, even if the knowledge would pierce his heart. Zuri's voice trembled as she continued, "I've made choices that haunt me. I thought I could be strong, but I'm just so tired." Each word hung in the air, heavy with despair, and Tendai felt the gravity of her pain pulling him down. He wanted to scream, to rail against the injustices that had driven her to this point, but all he could do was stand there, powerless, as her anguish unfolded before him. The tears streamed down Zuri's face, glistening in the light like shattered glass. Tendai felt his heart crack open, the rawness of her emotions resonating deep within him. He wanted to reach out, to wipe away her tears, to remind her that she was loved, that she was worthy of happiness. But the distance between them felt insurmountable, and he could only watch as she fought against the tides of her own despair. "I didn't want to hurt you," she whispered, her voice barely audible, but it struck him with the force of a thunderclap. The admission shattered the last remnants of hope he had clung to, and Tendai felt the world around him tilt. The love they had shared felt fragile, a delicate glass structure that threatened to shatter under the weight of her revelations. "I thought if I stayed away you'd be better off," she continued, her voice trembling with the weight of her confession. Tendai's heart ached at the sight of her, the beautiful soul before him now a wounded bird, struggling against the invisible chains that bound her. He felt the pull of her pain, a desperate desire to reach out and break those chains, to free her from the darkness that had taken hold. "But I can't do this alone anymore," Zuri admitted, her voice breaking as she surrendered to the weight of her emotions. The words hung in the air, a stark confession that resonated deep within him, striking a chord of longing and despair. Tendai felt a wave of compassion wash over him, a fierce desire to pull her back from the brink. As Zuri's tears fell, he could feel the weight of her sorrow pressing down on him, a darkness that threatened to engulf them both. The warmth of the sun streaming through the kitchen window felt distant, overshadowed by the shadows that danced in the corners. Tendai longed to bridge the gap, to remind her of the love they had once shared, but the enormity of her pain was overwhelming. In that moment he realized that love was not just about the laughter and the light, it was also about the darkness that they had to face together. He felt the call of her vulnerability, the rawness of her emotions beckoning him to step closer. But the fear of being engulfed by her pain held him back, and he stood there, torn between the desire to comfort her and the terror of what that would mean. Kofi shifted again, his small voice cutting through the heaviness in the air. "Auntie Zuri, are you okay?" The innocence in his question pierced Tendai's heart, a reminder of the child's world untouched by the storms of adulthood. He felt a surge of protectiveness for the boy, a fierce determination to shield him from the darkness that had invaded their lives. Zuri's gaze turned to Kofi, and for a moment a flicker of warmth crossed her face. But the shadows quickly returned, and Tendai could see the pain etched into her features. "I'm trying to be strong," she whispered, the admission barely audible, yet it echoed in the silence like a mournful cry. Tendai's heart shattered at the sight of her, the beauty and vulnerability colliding in a painful reminder of the depth of her struggle. He took a step closer, feeling the weight of the moment pressing down on him, the need to reach out and connect. But the fear of what lay ahead held him back, the uncertainty of whether he could truly save her from the darkness. Please, he thought, willing her to see the light that still flickered within her, to understand that they could face this together. The love that had once bound them felt distant, yet it still lingered like a ghost, waiting for the right moment to re-emerge. But as Zuri's tears fell, the darkness threatened to extinguish even the faintest glimmer of hope. "I need you," she finally confessed, her voice a broken whisper that reverberated through him. The words were a lifeline thrown into the storm, a desperate plea for connection that reached deep into his heart. Tendai felt the walls around him begin to crumble, the weight of her vulnerability drawing him closer. In that moment he realized that love was not a passive force, it was a choice, a commitment to stand together in the face of adversity. He could feel the pull of her pain, the desire to embrace her and help her find her way back to the light. With every fiber of his being, he wanted to fight for her, to remind her that she was not alone in this battle. As the tears continued to fall, Tendai took a deep breath, the air heavy with emotion. He felt the gravity of the moment, the significance of this dark revelation echoing through the room. He could no longer stand on the sidelines, paralyzed by fear. He had to take that step forward, to embrace the darkness and help Zuri find her way back to the light they had once shared. In the depths of despair, he felt the flicker of hope reignite within him. Together, they could weather the storm, face the darkness that had threatened to consume them. With a heart full of determination, Tendai reached out, closing the distance between them, ready to fight for the love that had once defined them, ready to confront the shadows that loomed ahead. The storm had passed, but the air was thick with the remnants of its fury, a heavy silence settling over the kitchen like a thick fog. Tendai stood motionless, his heart pounding as he took in the scene before him. Zuri, trembling and fragile, her eyes still glistening with tears, and Kofi, wide-eyed and confused, the innocence of childhood clashing starkly with the emotional turmoil that had unfolded. The weight of the moment pressed down on him, a bittersweet blend of relief and sorrow. Zuri's gaze drifted to the floor, her shoulders slumped as if the very act of standing had become a monumental task. Tendai felt a rush of compassion surge through him, a fierce desire to reach out and comfort her. But the shadows of the past hung heavy in the air, remnants of the pain they had both endured. He could see the fragility in her spirit, a flickering flame that had been so easily extinguished by the darkness she had fought for so long. Kofi shifted restlessly in his chair, glancing between the two adults, his small heart struggling to comprehend the emotional storm that had just swept through their lives. Tendai knelt beside him, placing a reassuring hand on Kofi's back, feeling the warmth of the boy's small body. He wished he could shield him from the weight of the world, to protect his innocent heart from the harsh realities that now loomed on the horizon. In that moment, Tendai felt the tremors of change coursing through him. The air, once charged with tension, now held a fragile promise of hope. Zuri was still here, her presence a reminder that even in the darkest of times the light could flicker back to life. As he looked at her, he saw not just the girl he had once loved, but a woman who was willing to confront her demons, to face the shadows that had haunted her for so long. Zuri's breath hitched, and Tendai felt a pang of empathy as she struggled to gather herself. The vulnerability etched on her face mirrored his own fears, and in that shared silence, an understanding began to blossom between them. It was a moment of reckoning, a fragile bridge connecting their hearts, a testament to their resilience in the face of despair. As Kofi returned to his crayons, lost once more in his innocent world, Tendai turned his full attention to Zuri. He felt the weight of his love for her swell within him, a powerful force that would not be silenced. The past had shaped them, but it would not define their future. He could feel the flicker of hope igniting between them, a shared promise to navigate the darkness together, hand in hand. The road ahead would not be easy, but as Tendai stood beside Zuri, he knew that they had already taken the most crucial step. They had faced the shadows, unearthing the pain that had long been buried. And in that act of courage, they had given themselves the chance to heal, to reclaim the light that had once defined their love. In the aftermath of the storm, amid the wreckage of their past, a new dawn began to break, a promise of renewal, of redemption, and of love rekindled. Tendai watched Kofi devour his pastry, the child's small fingers dusted in powdered sugar, blissfully unaware of the tension gripping his uncle. Tendai stirred his coffee, lost in thought as he gazed out the window of the quaint cafe. The morning sun filtered through the glass, painting everything in a warm, honeyed light that felt almost too peaceful given the storm brewing inside him. His mind reeled from the morning's events, the unexpected reappearance of Zuri, and the haunting weight that lingered in her eyes. He had barely taken a sip of his coffee when he sensed someone approaching. His body tensed. Tendai looked up, and there she was, Zuri. She wore a hesitant smile, the corners of her lips turned up in a way that seemed forced, as if she were walking into a battlefield rather than a cafe. "Is this seat taken?" she asked, her voice light, though her eyes betrayed the swirling undercurrent of emotion she was trying to hide. Tendai nodded stiffly. "It's open." She slid into the chair across from him, folding her hands on the table. The air between them grew thick, as if the very molecules were charged with unresolved tension, pressing down on them both. Zuri cleared her throat, glancing briefly at Kofi, who was now focused on his hot chocolate, blissfully unaware of the emotional minefield surrounding him. They sat in silence for a moment before Zuri finally spoke, her voice soft. "I didn't think I'd be back here so soon." The words hung in the air like a confession. Tendai's jaw clenched as he fought to control the rush of emotions stirring within him. "Funny, I thought you left for good." Her gaze dropped to her hands, fingers trembling slightly. "I thought I had, too." There was a strange sadness in her voice, a rawness that Tendai wasn't used to hearing from her. Zuri was always the composed one, the girl who met every challenge with grace, never allowing her true feelings to show. But now that veneer was cracking, and he could see the fragile woman beneath. Tendai took a slow breath, his tone colder than he intended. "So what brings you back? Couldn't stay away from all this small-town charm." Zuri's eyes shot up, piercing him with a look that was equal parts defiance and regret. "You have no idea," she said, her voice laced with an edge that sent a jolt through him. "You think it was easy for me to leave? That I just walked away without a second thought?" He was caught off guard, but he held her gaze. "It sure seemed like it. One day you were here, the next ... gone." Zuri's shoulders slumped, the weight of his words pressing down on her. "I didn't want to leave," she murmured, her voice barely audible. "But I had to." Tendai was about to respond when Kofi interrupted, holding up his sticky fingers proudly. "Look, Uncle Tendai." I made a smiley face with the chocolate. The innocence in Kofi's voice broke the tension, and both adults couldn't help but smile, though it was tinged with sadness. Zuri's gaze softened as she looked at Kofi, a faint glimmer of warmth breaking through her hardened exterior. The moment passed quickly, and the walls went back up, but Tendai had seen it, a flicker of something real, something vulnerable. When Kofi was occupied again, Zuri's attention shifted back to Tendai. Her eyes were shadowed, but there was a new resolve in her voice. "There's more you don't know, Tendai. Things I couldn't tell you then." He arched an eyebrow, trying to keep his tone even. "So tell me now." Zuri hesitated, biting her lip. For a moment he thought she might back out, but then she leaned forward, her voice a whisper. "I wasn't just leaving, I was ... running." From what Tendai's question was sharper than he intended. Zuri's eyes darted around the cafe, as if checking for invisible onlookers. Her voice trembled. "From someone. From something I did." She stopped herself, inhaling deeply as she looked at him. "I was in deep, Tendai. Deeper than I ever let on. I thought I could keep it from you, that I could keep you safe by staying away." Tendai felt his pulse quicken, the pieces of a puzzle he didn't even know existed falling into place. Safe from what, Zuri? She looked away, eyes glistening with unshed tears. From my past. From a man I thought I knew, someone I thought cared for me, her voice wavered. But I got it wrong. So wrong. Tendai's hand tightened around his coffee cup. What happened? Zuri swallowed, her voice barely above a whisper. He made me believe he was someone he wasn't. He had power, influence, connections. I got involved without understanding who he really was. By the time I realized, it was too late. I was already in over my head. The confession hit Tendai like a punch. He had always suspected Zuri held secrets, but this was more than he'd ever imagined. A chill crept down his spine. Zuri, are you saying you were ... in danger? She nodded, her expression pained. It got dangerous fast. I thought I could handle it on my own, but things spiraled. The people he was connected to, they were ruthless. And when I tried to get out, to leave him, he ... didn't take it well. Leaving him wasn't an option. Tendai's mind raced as he processed her words. So that's why you left? To protect yourself. Her gaze softened, her vulnerability laid bare. And to protect you. He knew about you, Tendai. I didn't realize it until it was too late, but he would have come for you if he thought it would keep me in line. The gravity of her words settled over him, a cold realization sinking in. Tendai's heart ached with a mixture of anger and regret. All this time he'd resented her for leaving, never understanding the sacrifice she'd made. She had walked away, not out of indifference, but out of desperation to shield him from a danger he never even knew existed. So why come back now, he asked, his voice thick with emotion. Zuri's eyes met his, filled with a blend of determination and fear. Because he's gone now. I stayed away until I knew for certain. He had some enemies of his own. They got to him before he could get to us. Tendai felt a jolt of shock, the weight of her revelation hitting him like a tidal wave. She had returned because she was finally free of the chains that had bound her to a dangerous past. The irony was bitter all this time. He'd resented her for leaving, while she had been fighting a battle he never even knew about. Zuri reached across the table, her hand hovering just above his. I came back because I couldn't stay away any longer. Because I knew it was finally safe for all of us. But I understand if she trailed off, her voice trembling as she pulled her hand back. If you can't forgive me. Tendai's heart pounded, a torrent of emotion swirling within him. Anger, regret, and something else, something warm, a rekindling of the love he had buried beneath layers of resentment. He reached out, his fingers brushing hers in a silent gesture of understanding. It's not about forgiveness, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. It's about moving forward. Together, if that's still something you want. A tear slipped down Zuri's cheek, and she nodded, her fingers tightening around his. In that moment they both felt a weight lift, a glimmer of hope breaking through the darkness that had shadowed their lives. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't easy, but for the first time they felt a flicker of something real, something worth fighting for. As Kofi finished his hot chocolate, oblivious to the silent promises exchanged between the two adults, Tendai and Zuri knew that their journey was far from over. But for the first time they faced it together, bound by the scars of the past and the hope of a new beginning. The air was crisp with the early afternoon breeze as Tendai, Zuri, and Kofi strolled into the park. It had been years since Tendai had come here, but everything felt strangely familiar: the ancient oak trees, the winding paths, the smell of freshly cut grass. They walked quietly, each lost in their own thoughts, Kofi's small hand nestled in his uncle's as he hopped along the path, oblivious to the tension simmering between the adults. They found a quiet spot under a willow tree, its branches hanging low, offering them a secluded space away from the bustle of the park. Kofi quickly darted to a nearby patch of wildflowers, picking one and examining it closely, his curiosity once again distracting him from the charged silence. Tendai and Zuri sat on a weathered wooden bench, each hesitant to break the quiet. The weight of the morning's revelations still lingered between them, but something unspoken pulsed in the air, a sense that more needed to be unearthed. The leaves rustled overhead, casting dappled sunlight across their faces, a quiet reminder of the days they'd once spent here together. Tendai cleared his throat, glancing at her. "This place hasn't changed a bit," he said, his voice almost nostalgic. Zuri smiled faintly, though it didn't reach her eyes. "No, it hasn't," she hesitated, her gaze drifting over to where Kofi was playing, twirling the flower in his small hands. Her expression softened, but Tendai could see a flicker of something else in her eyes, a shadow of pain. "You used to love coming here," he murmured, leaning back, hoping his casual tone would coax her to open up. "We'd walk for hours, just talking. It felt like nothing could touch us then." Zuri's smile faded, and her shoulders tensed. Those were better times. The words were heavy with regret, and Tendai turned to her, trying to read the expression on her face. She looked different here, more vulnerable, like the weight of her secrets had finally begun to lift. And then, before he could ask, she closed her eyes, a shaky breath slipping from her lips. "It's strange," she began softly, "to come back to a place that once held so much happiness and realize that happiness was fleeting." Tendai's brow furrowed, the longing in her voice pulling at something deep inside him. "What do you mean?" Zuri opened her eyes and looked at him, her gaze piercing. "There's more to my story, Tendai. More than just the man I left to escape. Coming back here, it brings it all back. The things I tried to forget. The choices I made." He felt his heart quicken, sensing the intensity behind her words. But before he could ask further, she looked away, her eyes focused on Kofi, who was now running along the edge of the grass, his laughter ringing through the air. Her lips pressed into a thin line. "I was so naive," she said quietly, almost as if speaking to herself. "When I left you, it wasn't just because of him. There was something else. Someone else." Tendai's stomach tightened. Someone else. The words left his lips before he could stop them, but the hurt in his voice was unmistakable. Zuri nodded slowly, a shadow passing over her face. "His name was Malik. I met him shortly after. After I left, he was like no one I'd ever known. Charming, successful, always knew the right things to say, but there was something about him that made me feel like I had to prove myself. Like I wasn't enough as I was. I thought he was the answer to the emptiness I felt after walking away from you." Tendai swallowed, his hands curling into fists. "And what happened with Malik?" Zuri's voice grew quiet. "He wasn't who I thought he was. He wasn't." Anyone's answer, she shivered, pulling her coat closer around her shoulders. "Malik pulled me into a world I wasn't ready for. I was just some naive girl in love with a fantasy, and that's what he gave me, a fantasy carefully woven with lies. But I didn't see it. Not until it was too late." Tendai could feel the anger rising in his chest, though he wasn't sure if it was directed at Malik, at Zuri, or at himself for never knowing. "What kind of lies?" he asked, his voice sharper than he intended. Zuri looked away, her eyes distant. "Everything about him was a lie, Tendai. He had this whole operation, a network of people who dealt in things I can't even talk about. But to me, he was just Malik, the man I thought I loved. By the time I realized the truth, I was trapped. He didn't let me leave, not without a price." Tendai's hand clenched around the edge of the bench, his mind reeling. He'd imagined her life without him as peaceful, perhaps even happy. This dark world she was describing felt like a nightmare. "So, that's why you stayed away." Zuri's gaze softened, and her voice dropped to a whisper. "I thought I could handle it. I thought I could keep everything separate. But it got complicated. He started to use my past against me, the things I'd told him in confidence, even things about you." She closed her eyes, pain twisting her face. "He threatened to hurt you if I left him." Tendai's blood ran cold. The weight of her confession settled heavily on him, and he struggled to breathe through the anger and disbelief churning inside him. He had spent years wondering what had driven her away, never imagining it was this tangled web of deceit and danger. "Why didn't you tell me?" he demanded, his voice thick with emotion. Zuri's hands twisted together in her lap, her gaze fixed on the ground. "Because I knew you'd try to save me. I knew you'd get involved, and I couldn't let that happen. You and Kofi were the only good things left in my life. I couldn't risk bringing you into his world. I couldn't let you get hurt." They sat in silence for a moment, the distant laughter of children and the rustling of leaves the only sounds around them. Tendai looked at her, his anger melting into a painful sympathy as he saw the toll this had taken on her. The woman before him was a shadow of the girl he'd once known, someone who had been scarred by secrets she'd kept hidden too long. "I never wanted to leave you, Tendai," she said finally, her voice breaking. "I thought I was protecting you. But it broke me in ways I can't even explain. And even after he was gone, I didn't know how to come back." The vulnerability in her voice struck him like a blow. She was baring her soul, showing him the pain and regret she had carried alone. He reached over, his hand finding hers, squeezing it gently. "You don't have to carry this alone anymore." She looked at him, a tear slipping down her cheek. "I don't know if I can start over, Tendai. I'm damaged. I feel like a stranger to myself. I don't even know who I am anymore." He leaned in, his voice steady. "You're Zuri. And whatever you went through, whatever you had to do to survive, it doesn't change that. We'll face it together." Zuri closed her eyes, the tension in her face finally easing as she squeezed his hand back. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to lean into the warmth of his presence, feeling the weight of her secrets lift, even if only slightly. They sat in silence, a quiet peace settling between them, though Tendai's mind was racing. Malik, the name alone filled him with dread, and he knew he needed to understand more about what had truly happened during those years. But for now, with Zuri at his side and Kofi's laughter filling the air, he allowed himself to simply be in the moment. Then as they sat there, Zuri broke the silence, her voice barely audible but unmistakably raw. "There's something else, Tendai." He turned to her, frowning. "What is it?" Zuri took a breath, steadying herself. "I wasn't just protecting you from him," she looked up, her gaze intense. "I was protecting something else. Malik left me with more than scars. He left me with something precious, something I had to hide, even from you." Tendai's heart pounded as he tried to process her words. She reached into her bag, pulling out an old, weathered photograph, a picture of a young boy, no older than Kofi, with bright, curious eyes that seemed to hold a world of secrets. "This is my son," Zuri whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "He's Malik's, but he's also mine." The world around them seemed to fade as Tendai stared at the photograph, the shock coursing through him. His mind reeled, his heart caught between anger, disbelief, and a strange sense of understanding. The woman he loved had endured horrors beyond his imagination, but she had also carried a piece of Malik, a piece that was innocent, a piece that Zuri had fought to protect at all costs. Tendai looked up at her, his own voice barely a whisper. "Zuri, why didn't you tell me?" Her gaze softened, her hand trembling as she reached out to touch his face. "Because I was afraid of losing you all over again. But I couldn't stay away. I had to come back for him. And for you." Tendai swallowed, feeling a surge of emotion that he couldn't contain. As they sat there, surrounded by the laughter of children and the rustling of leaves, he realized that this revelation, this boy, was not just Yuri's burden. It was a chance, fragile and full of promise, to rebuild the life they had lost. The salty tang of the ocean air hit Tendai's face as he stood on the rocky beach, the waves crashing at his feet. He glanced back at Zuri, who stood a few paces behind him, her arms wrapped around herself as if trying to shield her heart from the cold wind and the truth she was about to reveal. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the sand, and for a brief moment everything was quiet except for the sound of the ocean, a vast, relentless force echoing the turmoil within them both. Kofi was safely back at home, watched over by a neighbor who didn't ask questions when Tendai had quickly explained they needed some time alone. Now, as he looked at Zuri, he realized he was seeing her in a new light. She was as beautiful as ever, her dark curls swept back by the wind, her eyes filled with 1,000 unspoken words. But beneath that beauty was a fragility, a weight of sorrow he was only beginning to understand. Zuri took a deep breath, and he could tell she was steeling herself. When she met his gaze, her eyes were haunted, a storm of emotions swirling just beneath the surface. She took a step closer, her voice barely more than a whisper. "I brought you here because I need to tell you everything," she said. "I need you to understand." Tendai's chest tightened as he nodded. "I'm listening, Zuri." She turned her gaze to the horizon, the colors of the setting sun reflected in her eyes. "You know about Malik, about the lies and the danger he brought into my life. But there's a part one left out. The part one was too ashamed to tell you." Tendai held his breath, sensing that whatever she was about to say would change everything. "What is it?" She hesitated, her voice breaking. "Malik wasn't just dangerous. He was controlling. He didn't let me out of his sight, not even for a moment. When I first tried to leave him, he did something that still haunts me." She closed her eyes, as if reliving the pain. "He took me somewhere far from everyone, and he made sure I couldn't reach out to anyone. Not to you, not to my family, no one." Tendai felt his fists clench involuntarily. The image of Zuri, trapped and alone, twisted his stomach with anger and helplessness. "Where did he take you?" Her voice dropped to a whisper, barely audible over the roar of the waves. "A remote cabin, miles from any town. There were people who worked for him, who made sure I didn't leave. I was kept there, Tendai, for months, no contact, no freedom, just him and his people." Tendai took a step back, the enormity of her words settling over him like a heavy shroud. He couldn't even imagine the fear and isolation she must have felt. "Why didn't you tell me this before?" Zuri's eyes shimmered with unshed tears. "Because I thought it would change the way you see me, that you'd see me as broken, as damaged." Tendai felt his heart ache, but he reached out, his hand gently brushing hers. "You're not damaged, Zuri. You're stronger than anyone I know." She shook her head, a tear slipping down her cheek. "It's not just that, Tendai. There's something else. Something that happened while I was there." Her voice wavered, and Tendai could feel her reluctance, the weight of the secret she was struggling to reveal. "What happened?" he asked softly, not wanting to push her but desperate to understand. Zuri looked away, staring out at the ocean, as if the vastness of the sea could somehow make her pain smaller, easier to bear. "One night, after I tried to escape, Malik punished me. He made sure I'd never try to run again." Her voice broke, and Tendai's heart ached at the raw vulnerability in her tone. "And it was that night that I became pregnant with his son." The words hit Tendai like a physical blow, the revelation twisting his insides. He felt his heart pound, a mix of emotions flooding through him: anger, sorrow, and a profound sense of helplessness. Zuri's son wasn't just a remnant of her past with Malik. He was a reminder of a night filled with terror, of a life stolen from her. Tendai struggled to find his voice. You went through that alone." Zuri nodded, her eyes filled with pain. "I had no choice. Malik kept me under his control until I gave birth. He threatened to take my son from me, to hide him away if I didn't comply with his demands. I was trapped, Tendai. Every day I lived in fear that he would hurt my child. So I stayed silent. I obeyed. And the day I finally escaped was the day I vowed I'd never let that man have power over me again." Tendai reached for her hand, his own trembling with the weight of her confession. "You were protecting him," he whispered, the pieces of the puzzle finally falling into place. She nodded, her expression fierce. "I would do anything to protect him." "And to protect you," she looked down at their intertwined fingers, her voice a broken whisper. "That's why I stayed away. Because I knew that Malik's influence reached far beyond me. He had connections, people who would hurt you if they thought I was a threat." Tendai's mind spun, his heart torn between rage and an overwhelming desire to hold her, to shield her from everything she had suffered. He tightened his grip on her hand, feeling the cold wind whip around them, but ignoring it. "Zuri, you don't have to do this alone anymore. I'm here, we'll protect him together." But she pulled her hand away, her eyes filled with a deep sorrow. "It's not that simple, Tendai. Even though Malik is gone, his legacy, his shadows, they linger. There are still people who would see me as a threat, people who would see my son as a bargaining chip." Tendai's jaw clenched. "Then let them come. I won't let anyone hurt you or him. Not anymore." Zuri smiled faintly, a mix of gratitude and sadness in her expression. "You always did believe you could save me, Tendai. But this is not a battle that can be won with strength alone." He stepped closer, the intensity of his feelings for her making his voice rough. "Then how, Zuri? Tell me. I'll do whatever it takes. I'll fight anyone, go anywhere, if it means giving you a chance at happiness." She looked up at him, her eyes filled with a love that was shadowed by years of pain and fear. "I know you would," she said softly, "but it's not just me I'm worried about. My son. He deserves a life where he's not haunted by Malik's memory, where he's not tied to his father's crimes." Tendai's heart ached at the thought of a child caught in the web of his father's darkness. He took a deep breath, his voice firm. "We'll find a way, Zuri, together. I don't care what it takes, I don't care how dangerous it is. I'm not letting you go through this alone anymore." She looked at him, her expression softening as if his words were a balm to wounds that had been opened far too long. And in that moment, as the last rays of the setting sun cast a golden glow over them, something shifted between them. The walls she had built around herself began to crumble, and she allowed herself to lean into him, resting her head on his shoulder, finding comfort in his warmth. "I missed you," she whispered, her voice filled with a raw honesty that left Tendai breathless. He wrapped his arms around her, holding her tightly as if to anchor her to him, to remind her that she wasn't alone. "I missed you too, Zuri, more than you'll ever know." They stood there, wrapped in each other's arms, letting the sound of the waves wash over them, carrying away some of the pain and fear that had weighed them down. For a moment everything felt right, as if they were finally finding their way back to each other after years of wandering in darkness. But just as Tendai began to believe they might have a chance, Zuri stiffened in his arms, pulling back. Her eyes darted to the shoreline, her body tensing as if she'd seen a ghost. "What's wrong?" Tendai asked, alarmed by the sudden shift. Zuri's face was pale, her gaze fixed on a figure in the distance, a man standing near the edge of the water, his silhouette partially hidden in the shadows. Tendai squinted, trying to make out the stranger's features, but the fading light obscured his face. "It's him," Zuri whispered, her voice barely audible over the roar of the waves. Tendai's heart stopped. "Malik? I thought you said he was dead." Zuri shook her head, her voice trembling. I thought he was. But that's him, Tendai. I'd know that figure anywhere." A cold dread settled over Tendai as he watched the figure. The man's stance was relaxed, casual, as if he had all the time in the world. Tendai's instinct screamed at him to get Zuri away from here, to protect her, but he knew she wouldn't leave without confronting this nightmare that had haunted her. He took her hand, squeezing it tightly. "We'll face him together. You're not alone anymore, Zuri." She looked up at him, her fear mingling with determination. "No, I'm not." As the figure started moving closer, Tendai braced himself, knowing that the battle ahead would test them both in ways he couldn't yet imagine. But as he looked at Zuri, he knew they would face it together, bound by a love that had survived years of darkness and pain. And no matter what Malik or anyone else threw their way, Tendai was ready to fight for their future, for the life they had both dreamed of but never dared to hope for. The waves crashed around them, fierce and unrelenting, as they prepared to face the past and finally to reclaim their lives from the shadows. The cliff was rugged and wild, the wind whipping around them with a raw intensity that matched the emotions swirling between them. Tendai and Zuri stood side by side, gazing out over the edge, where the waves crashed furiously against the rocks below. The vastness of the ocean stretched before them, endless and daunting, but there was a strange calm here, an undeniable sense that this was where they needed to be. Zuri's face was pale, her eyes fixed on the horizon, as if she could lose herself in its endless expanse. Tendai could see her resolve wavering, her shoulders tense, as though carrying a weight too heavy to bear. He reached out, taking her hand in his, feeling the chill of her skin against his warmth. She looked up at him, and he saw it, the deep-rooted fear, the vulnerability she tried so hard to hide. "Zuri," he began softly, his voice steady, "you don't have to carry this alone anymore." She bit her lip, glancing away. "I wish it were that simple, Tendai. I'm not the same person I was when we met. There's too much darkness now, too much that I can't erase." Tendai shook his head, his grip on her hand tightening. "I don't care about the darkness, Zuri. I care about you." He took a step closer, his gaze unwavering. "Whatever happened in the past, whatever you think makes you unworthy of happiness, it doesn't change how I feel. I'm here and I'm not going anywhere." A shiver ran through her, and she took a shaky breath. "I can't promise you a life free from shadows, Tendai. I can't promise that everything will be okay." He brushed a strand of hair from her face, his touch gentle. "Then don't promise me that. Promise me this instead. Promise that we'll face those shadows together. Whatever comes, we won't let it tear us apart." Her eyes glistened, a tear slipping down her cheek as she gazed at him, searching his face for reassurance. "Do you mean that?" she whispered, her voice barely audible above the wind. "Even after everything I've told you?" He nodded, his voice firm. "Yes, even after everything." He lifted her hand, pressing it to his heart. "You have a piece of me, Zuri, and nothing, no one can take that away. I'm not letting you go again." For a moment her expression softened, the guarded look in her eyes melting away as she allowed herself to believe in him, to trust in the strength of his promise. She stepped closer, resting her head on his shoulder, and he wrapped his arms around her, anchoring her to him, as if to shield her from the world. But just as she began to relax, a new tension flickered across her face, and she pulled back slightly, a shadow returning to her eyes. "There's something else, Tendai," she murmured, her gaze drifting to the cliffs below. He frowned, his heart pounding. "What is it?" She hesitated, biting her lip. "There's someone else who knows about my son, someone who has a claim to him." The words hit him like a punch to the gut. "What do you mean, a claim?" Zuri's voice trembled as she continued. "It's Malik's family, his brother. He's trying to take my son away from me. He thinks he has a right to raise him, to mold him into Malik's image. He sees my son as a legacy." Tendai felt his pulse quicken, a surge of protectiveness overtaking him. "Over my dead body," he said, his voice filled with quiet fury. "No one's going to take your son from you, Zuri, no one." She looked up at him, desperation flickering in her eyes. "He's powerful, Tendai. He has resources, people who could make my life a nightmare. I don't know if I can fight him on my own." "Then you won't fight him alone," he replied fiercely. "We'll do whatever it takes to keep him safe. I'll be with you every step of the way." Zuri's lips parted, her eyes wide as she looked at him, the weight of his words settling over her like a balm to her wounded heart. "You'd really stand by me, even if it means facing Malik's family?" He cupped her face in his hands, his gaze unwavering. "I told you I'm not letting you go. Not now, not ever." He leaned down, his voice a whisper against her skin. "We'll protect him, Zuri. We'll build a life where no one can touch us. I promise you that." In that moment, standing at the edge of the cliff with the world stretching out before them, Zuri allowed herself to believe in his words. She reached up, wrapping her arms around his neck, and kissed him, a kiss filled with both desperation and hope, a silent vow to face the darkness together. As they stood entwined, the ocean crashing below, Tendai knew that this was only the beginning of their fight. But he also knew that together they could face anything, even the shadows that threatened to consume them. And as he held her close, he made a silent vow to himself, no matter the cost, he would protect this family, this fragile love, with everything he had. The countryside stretched before them, a tapestry of rolling hills and golden fields that seemed to promise peace. Tendai drove the old car down the narrow lane, glancing over at Zuri, who sat quietly beside him, her gaze fixed out the window. In the back seat, Kofi was humming a tune to himself, blissfully unaware of the tangled emotions his uncle and Zuri were navigating. They'd planned this retreat as a brief escape from the tension, a chance to reconnect in a place untouched by the weight of their shared past. Tendai had arranged for them to stay in a small, secluded cottage nestled by a crystal-clear lake, surrounded by nothing but nature and silence. He hoped it would give Zuri a chance to relax, to let go of the fear and burden she'd been carrying for so long. When they finally arrived, Kofi jumped out of the car, racing toward the lake, his laughter echoing across the still water. Tendai followed him, watching with a smile as Zuri stepped out of the car, looking around with a tentative expression, as though she were afraid to let herself feel peace. "It's beautiful here," she murmured, her voice soft. Tendai came up beside her. "I thought it might be good to get away from everything. Just us, just for a little while." Zuri nodded, giving him a grateful smile. "Thank you, Tendai. I haven't felt this calm in a long time." As evening fell, they gathered by the lake, a small fire crackling beside them. Kofi was asleep inside, worn out from the day's excitement. The two of them sat in companionable silence, watching the stars begin to peek through the twilight. Tendai couldn't help but feel the weight of everything they'd left unsaid, as if the countryside itself were coaxing secrets from the shadows. "You know, I almost forgot what it feels like to breathe," Zuri whispered, breaking the quiet. Her gaze was fixed on the stars, her expression softened in the warm glow of the fire. "Maybe it's time to let go of some of that weight," Tendai replied gently, reaching over to take her hand. Zuri looked down, her fingers curling around his. "Tendai, there's something I haven't told you about Malik, and why I stayed as long as I did." He looked at her, his heart pounding. "Go on." Zuri took a deep breath, her voice barely a whisper. "There was a moment when I almost became like him." She looked away, her face filled with shame. "He had a hold on me, not just because of fear, but because he made me believe I could be like him, that I was capable of the same cruelty." Tendai's chest tightened, but he kept his gaze steady. "What happened, Zuri?" "There was a man," she continued, her voice trembling. "He was close to Malik, part of his operation. He tried to get to me, to control me. And one night after Malik had hurt me, this man confronted me, taunting me, daring me to stand up for myself. And in that moment, Tendai," she swallowed hard, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears, "I almost did something I would never be able to take back. I almost hurt him in a way that would have changed who I am." Tendai's breath hitched. "But you didn't." Zuri shook her head, her voice choked with emotion. "No, I stopped myself just before it went too far. But the thought, it still haunts me. That darkness, it's inside me, Tendai. No matter how hard I try to escape it." He reached up, gently cupping her face. "That darkness was forced on you, Zuri. But you didn't let it consume you. You chose to walk away. You chose to be here with us. That choice is what defines you, not the shadows someone else cast over your life." She closed her eyes, leaning into his touch as if it were the only thing keeping her grounded. "I want to believe that," she whispered, "but sometimes I'm afraid I'll never be able to shake the memories, that they'll always be there, lurking beneath the surface." Tendai pulled her close, wrapping his arms around her as they sat in silence, the warmth of the fire casting soft shadows around them. "You're not alone in this, Zuri. We'll face those memories together. And we'll make new ones, better ones, ones that remind you of the light you still carry." She looked up at him, a glimmer of hope breaking through her sorrow. "Do you really think I can?" He smiled, brushing a tear from her cheek. "I know you can. You've already come so far. And no matter what, I'll be right here, every step of the way." In that moment, Zuri allowed herself to believe in his words, in the strength of their connection. The fire crackled beside them, and the stars shone brighter, as if bearing witness to the promise they'd forged in the quiet of the countryside, a promise of healing, of hope, and of love that could withstand even the deepest scars. As they sat there, bathed in starlight, Tendai felt the first stirrings of a future. He could finally envision one where shadows would always be present, but where they'd find peace in each other's arms, a sanctuary from the darkness of the past. The familiar scent of vanilla and butter filled the kitchen as Tendai poured a fresh batch of pancake batter onto the griddle. It was the same kitchen where he and Zuri had once shared countless breakfasts, and now it felt as if they were finally returning to the heart of something they'd lost. Zuri stood nearby, watching him with a soft smile, a look of calm that hadn't graced her face in years. The morning light spilled through the windows, bathing the room in a warm glow that felt almost sacred. Kofi was upstairs, still fast asleep, allowing the two of them a rare moment alone. "It's strange, isn't it?" Zuri said, her voice quiet. "Being here again. I never thought I'd find peace in this house." Tendai glanced at her, flipping a pancake with a practiced ease. Sometimes the only way to make peace with the past is to return to where it all began. She leaned against the counter, her fingers tracing idle patterns on the cool surface. "When I left, I thought I could run from everything, from the mistakes, from the darkness. But coming back, I'm realizing that those things will always be part of me." Tendai turned off the stove, wiping his hands on a dish towel as he walked over to her. "Maybe it's not about erasing the past. Maybe it's about choosing how it shapes us." Her eyes met his, a spark of hope mingling with the fear that lingered there. "And how do we do that, Tendai? How do we turn all of this pain into something good?" He reached out, taking her hands in his. "By accepting it. By letting it be part of our story instead of something we hide from. And by finding strength in each other, in what we're building together." Zuri looked down at their intertwined fingers, a soft smile tugging at her lips. "I never thought I'd find my way back to you. I never thought I'd feel worthy of this." "You're more than worthy, Zuri," he said, his voice filled with conviction. "And I think deep down you've always known that." They stood in silence, the warmth of the kitchen enveloping them, as if it too were welcoming them back. But then a quiet knock on the front door shattered the moment, cutting through the tranquility like a knife. Tendai exchanged a look with Zuri, a hint of apprehension flickering in her gaze. "Are you expecting someone?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. He shook his head, his brow furrowing. "No, no one knows we're here, except a few close friends." They both moved toward the door, Tendai positioning himself in front as he reached for the handle. He opened it slowly, his heart pounding, but what he saw on the other side froze him in place. Standing there was a man he didn't recognize, dressed in an impeccably tailored suit, his gaze cold and calculating. He looked at Zuri, a smirk tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Zuri," he said, his voice smooth but laced with an unsettling familiarity. "I see you've made yourself at home." Tendai felt Zuri's hand grip his arm, her nails digging into his skin as she took a step back. Her face had gone pale, her eyes wide with horror. "Jonah," she breathed, her voice barely a whisper. The man's smile widened. "I was beginning to think I'd never find you. But here you are, playing house." His gaze flicked to Tendai, a look of disdain flashing across his face. "And with him no less." Tendai's mind raced, pieces of the puzzle snapping into place. This was the brother of Malik, the one Zuri had feared would come looking for her. The man who claimed her son as a part of his legacy. Jonah stepped forward, his presence filling the small entryway with an oppressive weight. Zuri's voice shook as she took another step back. "You have no right to be here, Jonah. Malik's gone. You have no claim to us." Jonah's gaze sharpened, his smile fading. "Malik may be gone, but his influence isn't. He left something valuable behind, a son, my nephew, and I intend to bring him into the family where he belongs." Tendai moved protectively in front of Zuri, his voice cold. "You're not taking anyone. This is her son, her life. You have no right to come here and threaten that." Jonah's eyes narrowed, the air between them crackling with tension. "You think you can protect her? You think you're any match for the network Malik and I built?" He took a step closer, his voice dripping with contempt. "The only reason you're standing here is because I allowed it. The words hung in the air, a threat and a challenge wrapped into one. Tendai clenched his fists, feeling the weight of the battle that lay ahead. But just as he opened his mouth to respond, Zuri stepped forward, her gaze fierce, her voice steady. "No, Jonah," she said, her tone defiant. "You don't get to control me anymore. You don't get to lay claim to my son, to our lives. Whatever power you think you have over me, it ends here." Jonah's smirk faded, replaced by a flicker of something colder, darker. But Zuri didn't back down, her voice growing stronger. "I left Malik. I left that world. Because I wanted something real, something built on love, not fear. And I'm not afraid of you anymore." Tendai felt a surge of pride as he watched her, standing tall, refusing to let the shadows of her past dictate her future. Jonah's expression hardened, but he seemed to recognize the determination in her eyes, the unbreakable bond she and Tendai shared. "You're making a mistake," Zuri, Jonah said, his voice dangerously soft. "You can't run from your blood, and you can't hide from what's coming." She met his gaze, unflinching. "Watch me." With one last, scornful glance, Jonah turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows outside. Tendai closed the door, his hand trembling as he locked it. He turned to Zuri, pulling her into his arms, his voice a murmur against her hair. "We'll face this, together." She nodded, burying her face against his chest, her body shaking as the weight of the confrontation settled over her. But as they held each other in the warmth of the kitchen, Tendai knew that they had found something stronger than fear. They had found a reason to stand, to fight, to reclaim their lives from the darkness. And as they stood there, the faint sound of Kofi's footsteps on the stairs broke the silence, a reminder of what they were fighting for, a future where love could conquer even the darkest of shadows. Tendai and Zuri wandered the town in silence, each step taking them deeper into shared memories. It was strange, this dance of familiarity and distance between them. The streets were unchanged, the same uneven cobblestones, the same shops tucked between their weathered brick facades. Zuri walked beside him with a quiet hesitation, her gaze flitting over the familiar sights, like she was looking at a ghost of herself, scattered across the places that had once held their laughter, arguments, and shared dreams. The first stop on this unplanned journey was the old bookstore on the corner. The windows, fogged from years of humidity and dust, still displayed the same faded posters and second-hand books that they had once browsed together on countless afternoons. Zuri slowed as they passed, her steps faltering for a moment. Tendai felt the familiar pang of nostalgia, watching her eyes trace the outline of the shelves inside. He remembered how she would lose herself in those shelves, her fingers dancing over the spines, lost in worlds he couldn't enter. There was a sadness in her gaze now, a kind of wistful ache that made him feel as if she were longing for more than just the books she'd once loved. They continued walking, leaving the bookstore behind, the silence thick but companionable. He stole glances at her as they made their way through the streets, her face touched by a kind of sorrow that mirrored his own. They passed the coffee stand where they'd once shared countless early mornings, huddled together with steaming cups, watching the world slowly wake up around them. Tendai could almost feel the warmth of her laughter, the softness in her eyes when she would tease him about his coffee addiction, or the way she'd wrinkle her nose at the bitterness but sip anyway, just to be close to him. Now it was a quiet space, empty of customers, the familiar barista inside barely sparing them a glance as they passed by. As they walked, the weight of the years stretched between them, filled with all the words left unsaid. Tendai tried to focus on the present, on the sound of their footsteps against the cobblestones, but his mind kept slipping back to other days. Memories rose unbidden, each one sharper than the last. He remembered a summer day when they'd taken refuge from the heat in a little gelato shop down the alley. It had been a relief from the oppressive sun, a small retreat in the cool darkness, the sweetness of shared spoons and stolen kisses. Zuri had laughed then, carefree and unguarded, as she leaned into him, her cheeks flushed from the chill of the gelato and the warmth of his touch. Now the alley seemed darker, narrower, the shop shuttered, as if time itself had moved on from those happy moments. They drifted towards the old art gallery next, the one where they'd once spent entire afternoons, pointing out paintings and pretending to decipher their meanings. It was closed now, its windows dusty, with signs of neglect creeping over its faded walls. Tendai remembered Zuri's fascination with the abstract art, her eyes lighting up as she explained her interpretations with such conviction, making him feel as though he was seeing the colors and brushstrokes through her eyes. He'd only pretended to care about the art, his attention drawn instead to the quiet beauty in her expressions, the way her fingers would hover in the air as she tried to capture the images she saw in her mind. The gallery was a relic now, like so much of their shared past, once bright and alive, now a shadowed reminder of things left behind. Their path led them through the quieter parts of town, to the gardens where they had once walked hand in hand, dreaming of a future neither of them fully understood. The flowers were in bloom, filling the air with a fragrance that was both intoxicating and bittersweet. Tendai felt the memories surge up, sharp and painful. He could almost see them, younger versions of themselves, laughing as they wove through the garden, stopping to admire the roses that Zuri had loved so much. She had once told him that roses were proof that beauty and thorns could coexist, and he'd teased her for her dramatics. But now he saw the truth in her words, the way beauty and pain were intertwined, like petals and thorns, like love and loss. They reached the old stone bridge that arched over the narrow river at the edge of town. The water below was calm, mirroring the sky, the trees on either side casting shadows that danced in the gentle current. It had been here, on this very bridge, that he had first confessed his love for her. The memory was as vivid as if it had just happened, his heart pounding, the words slipping out in a rush, her startled laughter, and then her quiet "I love you too," spoken with a sincerity that had both terrified and completed him. They had stood here for what felt like hours afterward, watching the river flow by, feeling as if time itself had paused to witness their shared vow. Now the bridge felt cold, the weight of their past love heavy in the silence that stretched between them. The sun was beginning to set as they neared the small chapel at the edge of town, its stained glass windows catching the fading light. It had been one of Zuri's favorite places, a sanctuary of quiet and peace, even though neither of them was particularly religious. She would sit in the pews, her eyes closed, breathing in the stillness, as if she could find solace in the silence. Tendai would watch her, feeling a deep, unexplainable longing to protect her, even from the things he couldn't see. Standing outside the chapel now, he felt that same longing again, stronger than ever, mixed with a fierce regret for all the moments they had lost. They lingered by the chapel for a long moment, neither of them speaking. He could feel the weight of everything that had been left unsaid between them, a vast ocean of words and emotions stretching into the distance. As the light faded, they began to walk back, the familiar path taking on a new significance. It was as if each step carried them deeper into a shared silence, one that held both the pain of their separation and the tentative hope that maybe, just maybe, they could find a way forward. By the time they returned to the starting point of their walk, Tendai felt a strange sense of peace settle over him. It wasn't a peace born of resolution, but rather a quiet acceptance of all they had been through, of all the scars they had collected along the way. He glanced at Zuri, her face softened by the dim light, and saw in her eyes a reflection of his own journey, a mixture of sorrow, regret, and the faintest glimmer of hope. In that moment he realized that this walk had not only been a journey through their shared memories, but also a way of coming to terms with the shadows that lingered between them. It was an unspoken understanding, a recognition that their past would always be a part of them, but that they could choose how to carry it forward. Tendai and Zuri reached the park just as the early afternoon sun began to dip behind the trees, casting long, dappled shadows over the grassy expanse. The place was nearly deserted, the usual buzz of families and children replaced by an unusual quiet that settled over the grounds like a gentle veil. Tendai led them down a winding path to a more secluded area, where the willow trees grew close, their branches drooping low enough to offer a sense of privacy. Here, shielded by the soft whisper of leaves in the breeze, Zuri seemed to let her shoulders relax, if only slightly. They took a seat on a worn wooden bench, positioned to overlook a small pond. Tendai's gaze drifted across the water, watching how it reflected the surrounding trees, the reflections broken only by the occasional ripple from a dragonfly or falling leaf. There was a strange beauty in this small oasis, a fragile sense of peace that belied the weight they both carried. He could sense her beside him, tense and guarded, and although he longed to reach out, to give her the reassurance he knew she needed, he held back, letting her come to her own resolve in her own time. The silence between them was heavy, but not uncomfortable. They had always shared a way of communicating without words, and now it felt even more poignant, as if language could only break the spell cast by their unspoken connection. As the minutes ticked by, he noticed Zuri's gaze fixed on the water, her expression far away, as though she was seeing something just beyond the surface. There was a deep sadness in her eyes, a heaviness that had not been there before. It was as if this park, their shared sanctuary in times past, had peeled away her armor, leaving her vulnerable, exposed. Tendai sat quietly waiting, sensing that she was gathering herself, mustering the courage to peel back the layers of her past. He felt a pang of empathy as he watched her, recognizing in her face the silent battle she fought to reconcile who she had been with the person she had become. He could almost feel her memories pressing in around them, like the echo of shadows from another world, a world he had only glimpsed through fragments of her hesitant confessions. After a while, Zuri exhaled slowly, her fingers absently tracing patterns along the edge of the bench. He noticed her hands, the way they trembled slightly, as if they were struggling to let go of a weight too long carried alone. There was an elegance to her silence, a resilience woven into the pauses, and he knew that whatever she held inside was vast and consuming. She glanced up at the willow branches, watching as the wind moved through them, their leaves whispering a sound like secrets in the breeze. Her face softened as she watched them, and he wondered if she saw herself in those branches, fragile, bending but unbroken, holding fast despite the storms that had swept through her life. For a brief moment he caught a glimpse of the girl he had fallen in love with years ago, a girl who had once been as free as the wind, her laughter bright and unguarded, but that girl was now hidden beneath layers of pain and loss, shadows of a life he could barely comprehend. Eventually she looked back at the pond, her gaze intense yet hollow, as if staring down into her own past. Tendai remained silent, sensing that this was her battle to face, her story to tell. He could feel her memories gathering like a storm, ready to break free from the chains she had wrapped around them. Zuri's fingers stilled, and her shoulders seemed to sink slightly, as if surrendering to the weight of what she was about to unveil. She began to speak, her voice low and steady, her words more for herself than for him. Tendai listened, his gaze fixed on the pond, but every word was a knife that cut through the stillness around them, leaving invisible scars on the afternoon's peace. She spoke of Malik in halting fragments, weaving together images of a man who had once been charming, magnetic and intense. She described the allure of his charisma, the way he had pulled her into a world that was intoxicating and mysterious, and how she had been drawn to him, believing herself to be a part of something greater, something dangerous and thrilling. Tendai felt a chill as he realized how vulnerable she must have been, how easily Malik had molded her perception of reality, like clay in his hands. As she spoke, Tendai noticed the gradual change in her tone, the bitterness that seeped in, the quiet fury that laced her voice when she recounted Malik's gradual transformation. The man she had thought she knew had been nothing more than an illusion, a mask worn by someone cruel, someone whose influence spread far beyond her life. Malik, she revealed, had drawn her into a dark world, surrounded by people who operated beyond the reach of the law, people who held power and secrets that stretched like an underground web across the lives of unsuspecting others. Tendai's heart ached as she continued, her voice barely above a whisper. She described her slow descent into fear, the way Malik had tightened his grip on her, isolating her from her family, her friends, and eventually even herself. She had learned to live with his control, to navigate his moods, always fearful of saying or doing the wrong thing. Each word she spoke painted a clearer picture of the prison she had endured, a prison without walls, held together by his manipulative threats and the looming presence of those who supported him. There were moments when her voice faltered, her sentences breaking off into silence as she seemed to relive the trauma, staring into the pond as if it could offer her some kind of absolution. Tendai's hands clenched in his lap as he listened, his heart heavy with a mix of anger and helplessness. He had no words to ease the pain she carried, no way to change the events that had led her to this place. All he could do was bear witness to her suffering, to the strength it had taken to survive and escape. Zuri went on, speaking of the fear that had consumed her when she realized Malik would never let her go, that she was nothing more than a possession in his eyes, a pawn in his games of power and control. The realization had come slowly, but it had come with a clarity that terrified her. Tendai could see the pain in her face as she described the night she had made her choice to flee, to sever herself from that life and all its trappings, knowing the cost it would exact on her heart, on her sense of self, and on the love they had once shared. She spoke of the months after she left, the constant fear that had haunted her, the weight of guilt and regret pressing down on her every day. She had learned to live with the fear, to exist in a kind of half-life, always looking over her shoulder, always hiding in the shadows. Tendai's heart clenched as he listened, realizing the depth of her sacrifice, the strength it had taken to survive, to keep going despite the weight of her past. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows over the pond, and Zuri's voice grew softer, her words trailing off into the quiet that had settled around them. She seemed drained, as if every word had taken a part of her strength, leaving her vulnerable and exposed in a way that he had rarely seen. Tendai sat beside her in silence, absorbing the weight of her confession, feeling an ache that spread through his entire being. Without speaking, he reached out, placing a hand on hers, offering her a quiet, unspoken assurance. She didn't look at him, but her fingers curled around his, a silent acceptance of the comfort he offered. They sat together, their hands intertwined, the weight of her past settling between them like a shadow that would always linger, but one they could now face together. As the evening light began to fade, Zuri finally looked up, meeting his gaze with a vulnerability that struck him to the core. There was no need for words, he could see everything in her eyes, the pain, the regret, the hope that had somehow survived, despite everything. And in that moment Tendai understood that her story, her suffering, was not something he could ever fully understand, but it was something he could hold with her, a burden they could carry together. The park grew still around them, the sounds of the world falling away, leaving only the quiet strength that flowed between them. Tendai held her gaze, his heart swelling with a determination he had not felt before. Whatever lay ahead, whatever shadows still lingered from her past, he knew that they would face it together. She was not alone, and for the first time he felt as if he had found his purpose, not to erase her pain, but to stand beside her, to be her anchor in the storm. As the last light of day faded, Tendai felt a strange sense of peace settle over him. It wasn't the peace of resolution or clarity, but the peace of understanding that some things could not be changed, only accepted. And in that acceptance he found a quiet strength, a willingness to face whatever challenges lay ahead, to walk through the shadows, not alone, but with her by his side. The wind off the ocean was sharp and bracing as Tendai and Zuri made their way across the rocky stretch of beach. The air held a salty chill that seeped through their clothes, but Zuri didn't seem to notice. She walked a few paces ahead, her gaze fixed on the waves rolling in, cresting and breaking against the shore in a rhythm as steady and relentless as time itself. Tendai followed quietly, watching her shoulders tense and relax with each breath, as if she were trying to draw strength from the sea. They'd come here on a whim, seeking some solace in the vastness of the water, a place where words and memories might be swallowed by the endless horizon. He could tell the journey through the park and the confessions they'd shared had left her drained, yet there was something resilient in her posture, something that refused to be broken even by the ghosts of her past. The sun hung low on the horizon, casting a golden glow over the landscape and making everything seem softer, almost dreamlike. For a moment it felt as if the sea and sky were holding their breath along with them. Kofi had stayed back with a trusted friend, giving them a rare moment alone. It was a decision made out of necessity, but Tendai had to admit he felt the need for this solitude, the quiet companionship of just him and Zuri against the backdrop of nature's vastness. He watched as she drew closer to the water, her steps slowing until she came to a stop a few meters from the edge, where the waves lapped softly against the sand. Tendai kept his distance, sensing that she needed this moment something that was hers alone, free from judgment or expectation. As she stood there, her silhouette framed against the expanse of water, Tendai was struck by how small and fragile she seemed against the grandeur of the ocean. But as the minutes passed, he realized that this place suited her. The vastness mirrored the quiet strength she carried, a resilience forged in solitude, a spirit weathered by storms yet unyielding. He watched as her hair lifted in the wind, the dark curls wild and untamed, like waves crashing against unseen rocks. The sight filled him with an unexpected ache, a mixture of admiration and sadness that he couldn't fully explain. Tendai's gaze drifted to the sky, where clouds gathered, tinged with hues of violet and amber. The sea echoed the colors, its surface shimmering in the waning light. It was a beautiful scene, one he might have appreciated for its peacefulness under other circumstances. But there was something else in the air, something darker, a tension he couldn't quite place. He glanced back at Zuri, noting the slight rigidity in her stance, the way her hands were clenched at her sides. It was as if she sensed something too, a shadow looming just out of sight. Without warning, Tendai's instincts flared, a prickling sensation running down his spine. His gaze sharpened, scanning the beach and the cliffs that rose steeply from the shore. There was nothing, only the distant cry of seagulls and the hiss of the waves, yet he couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone. He looked back at Zuri, about to call her name, but then stopped, his attention snagged by a figure standing at the water's edge, some distance down the beach. The man was still, almost like a statue, his silhouette dark against the shifting colors of the sea. He was far enough away that Tendai couldn't make out his features, but something about his stance set off alarms in his mind. The stranger's posture was casual, almost too casual, as if he were merely admiring the view, but Tendai knew better. This was no random beachcomber. He felt a sudden chill, colder than the ocean breeze. As the man turned slightly, his gaze settling on them with an intensity that was impossible to ignore. Tendai's breath caught as he watched the figure, his mind racing through the possibilities. The man seemed familiar, but not in any comforting way. There was something in his stance, his calculated stillness, that reminded Tendai of stories Zuri had told him, fragments of memories she had shared reluctantly, her voice filled with dread. He glanced at her, noticing the way she had stiffened, her gaze locked on the figure, her face draining of color. It was then that he realized this was no stranger. For a moment the beach seemed to dissolve around them, the wind and waves fading into a hollow silence. Tendai's heart pounded as he looked back at the man, feeling an anger rise in him that was as fierce as it was unexpected. He wanted to shield her from this, to take her away from the ghosts that refused to let her go. But Zuri remained motionless, her expression frozen in a mixture of fear and disbelief. The man began to walk toward them, his movements unhurried, as if he had all the time in the world. Each step was deliberate, calculated, sending a shiver through Tendai. Zuri's hand gripped his arm, her fingers digging in with a desperation he hadn't felt from her before. Tendai glanced down at her, seeing the raw vulnerability in her eyes, a vulnerability he had thought long buried. There was no mistaking it, she knew him, and whatever history lay between them, it was something dark, something that had left a mark too deep to erase. The stranger stopped a short distance from them, his expression inscrutable, though his gaze lingered on Zuri with a familiarity that made Tendai's skin crawl. He didn't move closer, but his presence was as oppressive as a storm cloud, filling the space between them with an unspoken threat. Tendai felt his muscles tense, his instincts screaming at him to protect her. But he held his ground, waiting, sensing that any wrong move could shatter the fragile tension that hung in the air. Zuri took a shaky breath beside him, her gaze never leaving the man. Tendai could see the memories flickering in her eyes, memories of a time she had fought to escape, memories that had clearly returned to haunt her. She looked as if she were facing down a nightmare made flesh, a phantom from her past that had risen from the shadows to confront her once more. The man's lips curled into a slight smirk, a gesture that held no warmth, only a cold, predatory amusement. It was as if he were savoring her fear, relishing the power he still held over her after all this time. Tendai's jaw clenched, anger flaring up within him. He had seen Zuri brave so much, had watched her rebuild herself from the ashes of her past. And now this man, a spectre she had believed gone, had returned to strip her of the peace she had fought so hard to reclaim. He felt a surge of protectiveness rise in him, an urge to shield her from this intruder, to break the hold this man had over her. But something in Zuri's eyes stopped him, a silent plea for restraint, a reminder that this was her battle to face. The silence stretched between them, heavy and charged, as if the world itself were holding its breath. The stranger's gaze shifted briefly to Tendai, and he felt the weight of the man's scrutiny, as if he were being assessed, measured, judged. But Tendai met his gaze without flinching, letting his own anger simmer just beneath the surface. He wanted the man to know that whatever hold he thought he had over Zuri, it would not go unchallenged. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the man's smirk faded, replaced by a look of cold indifference. He inclined his head slightly, a mocking gesture of acknowledgement, as if to say he had seen enough, that their silent standoff was of little consequence to him. Then, without a word, he turned and walked away, his steps as unhurried as before, leaving them in stunned silence as his figure disappeared down the beach. Zuri exhaled a breath she had been holding, her shoulders sagging as the tension drained from her. Tendai remained close, his hand reaching for hers instinctively, offering her a steadying presence. He didn't speak, didn't press her for explanations. He knew that the encounter had been a reminder of all she had tried to leave behind, a painful resurgence of memories that would take time to process. They stood there for a long while, watching the man's silhouette grow smaller against the horizon until he was nothing more than a shadow, a distant memory fading into the twilight. Tendai felt his heart settle, the anger dissipating as he held Zuri close, grounding her in the present, in the safety of his presence. The waves continued their steady rhythm, indifferent to the turmoil that had swept through the beach, as if offering a reminder that time moved on, regardless of the shadows that lingered. As the first stars appeared in the sky, Tendai felt a quiet determination settle within him. He knew that this man, this stranger from her past, would not fade away so easily, that his presence was a harbinger of challenges yet to come. But he also knew, with a certainty as steady as the sea itself, that he would stand by her side, that he would not let her face this darkness alone. The cliffside was raw and desolate, the wind whipping around Tendai and Zuri with a fierce, unrelenting force. It felt like the edge of the world, the rugged landscape a stark contrast to the softness of the beach they'd just left behind. Here nature was brutal. Untamed rocks jutted out like sharp teeth over the churning waves far below, and the sky hung heavy, bruised with the promise of an oncoming storm. There was something fitting about this place, as if the elements themselves were reflecting the turmoil that Zuri carried inside her. They walked in silence along the cliff's edge, the ground uneven beneath their feet, small stones scattering and tumbling down into the abyss below with each step. Tendai kept a careful distance, allowing her the space she seemed to need, though he remained close enough to steady her if she faltered. She moved slowly, almost cautiously, her gaze fixed on the horizon, where the sky met the sea in a haze of muted greys and deep blues. Her face was pale, her expression unreadable, yet he could feel the weight of the secrets she held, pressing down on her with every step. Finally they stopped at a narrow outcropping, a natural ledge where they could look out over the endless expanse of water. The wind howled around them, pulling at Zuri's hair and clothes, as if trying to strip away the barriers she had built around herself. Tendai stayed silent, sensing that she was on the brink of something, that she had brought him here not just to see the view but to confront the truth she had hidden for so long. She stood at the edge of the ledge, her arms wrapped around herself, eyes locked on the waves crashing below. There was something haunting about her posture, a vulnerability he had rarely seen. She looked as if she were balancing on the edge of a precipice, caught between holding on to her secrets and letting them fall into the depths, freeing herself from their grip. Tendai's heart ached as he watched her, wanting to reach out to steady her, yet knowing that this was a moment she needed to face alone. Zuri's gaze remained fixed on the water, her face shadowed with memories that seemed as endless as the sea. The wind drowned out all other sounds, isolating them in a cocoon of silence, broken only by the crash of the waves. Her hands clenched at her sides, and he noticed the faint trembling in her fingers, a sign of the internal battle she was fighting. She seemed smaller here, fragile in a way he hadn't fully understood before, and yet there was a strength in her stance, an unbreakable resolve that spoke of all the years she had survived, even when the world had offered her little but darkness. After what felt like an eternity, Zuri closed her eyes, her face softening, as if she was surrendering to the weight of her past. Her shoulders sagged slightly, and Tendai could almost feel the release, the silent relinquishment of the burden she had carried alone for so long. She seemed to draw strength from the wind, allowing it to strip away the layers of fear and shame, exposing the raw truth beneath. Tendai's breath hitched as he realized how much she must have endured in silence, how deeply those secrets had scarred her. And then, in that quiet, windswept moment, Zuri turned her face to him, her eyes glistening with an emotion he couldn't quite name. It was as if she were offering him a glimpse into the hidden parts of herself, the fragments of a life she had kept locked away. There was no need for words. He could see the pain and the resilience in her gaze, the strength it had taken to stand here, to trust him with the broken pieces of her past. Without a word, Tendai stepped closer, reaching out to take her hand in his. She didn't pull away. Instead, she let him hold her, her fingers intertwining with his, as if seeking an anchor. They stood together on the edge of the cliff, grounded by each other's presence, the silence between them no longer heavy with secrets but filled with a quiet understanding. The wind whipped around them, fierce and unyielding, yet in that moment they were steady, bound by the unspoken promise of healing and the fragile hope of a future free from shadows. The countryside stretched out before them like a forgotten corner of paradise, untouched and untroubled by the complexities of the lives they'd left behind. Tendai guided the car down a narrow dirt road, flanked by wildflowers and rolling hills, the golden hues of late afternoon casting everything in a soft, almost ethereal light. Zuri sat quietly beside him, her gaze drifting over the landscape, a mixture of weariness and longing etched into her features. She looked almost peaceful here, as if the vastness of the countryside offered her a momentary escape from the shadows that had pursued her for so long. They arrived at a small, secluded cottage nestled near a crystal-clear lake, surrounded by a thick ring of trees that offered both shelter and privacy. Tendai watched as Zuri stepped out of the car, her eyes wide as she took in their surroundings, the faintest hint of a smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. There was something childlike in her expression, a glimpse of the girl she might have been, unburdened and free. He felt a surge of relief seeing her like this, a brief reprieve from the weight that had been crushing her since her return. Inside, the cottage was simple yet warm, filled with the scents of cedarwood and old leather, the furniture worn but welcoming. The walls were adorned with landscape paintings and family portraits, as if to remind its occupants of the generations who had found solace within its walls. Tendai watched as Zuri ran her fingers over the rough-hewn wooden table, her eyes softening as if she could feel the history embedded in every corner. It was a place untouched by her past, free of the memories that had haunted her. Here she could exist in the present, if only for a little while. As evening settled in, they sat by the lake, a small fire crackling between them, casting a warm glow that reflected off the water's still surface. Tendai looked over at her, catching a rare moment of ease in her expression as she gazed at the fire, her face illuminated by its flickering light. The wind was gentle, carrying with it the scent of wild grasses and distant wood smoke, grounding them in the simplicity of this place. For the first time he saw her relax, the usual tension in her shoulders melting away, her hands resting loosely in her lap. But as the silence deepened, Tendai sensed a shift in her demeanor. She grew quiet, almost withdrawn, her gaze turning from the fire to the stars just beginning to emerge in the twilight sky. Her face held an intensity that hadn't been there before, as if she were weighing something in her mind, a decision that pressed upon her with an undeniable urgency. He didn't press her, he knew by now that her revelations came in waves, each one carrying its own weight, demanding patience and understanding. After a long pause, Zuri exhaled slowly, her breath visible in the cool night air. She looked at him, her expression unguarded in a way he had rarely seen, her eyes reflecting both vulnerability and a newfound resolve. There was a sadness there, a shadow that ran deeper than he'd realized, and as she looked away, back at the lake, he felt his heart clench with the understanding that something profound was coming. With her gaze fixed on the water, she began to speak, her voice low and steady, each word careful, as if she were unraveling a tightly bound thread. She spoke of a truth she had buried deeply, something she had kept hidden even from herself. There was no anger in her tone, only a resigned acceptance, a weariness that spoke of years spent wrestling with a part of herself she had tried to forget. Tendai listened, his mind racing to absorb the weight of her confession. She spoke of a time when her desperation had led her to consider paths she never would have imagined. During the darkest days with Malik, she had been pushed to her limits, manipulated into believing she was capable of the same darkness he harbored. There had been a night she had barely allowed herself to remember when she had almost crossed a line, almost given in to the shadows he had cast over her. It was a moment she had fled from, yet one that still haunted her, a memory that lingered in the quiet spaces of her mind. Her voice shook as she recounted that night, the memory raw and painful, a wound that had never fully healed. She had looked in the mirror and seen someone she didn't recognize, someone tainted by Malik's influence. It was that realization, that brush with darkness, that had driven her to leave, to reclaim herself before it was too late. But even after her escape, the memory had followed her, a ghost that lingered in every quiet moment, reminding her of how close she had come to losing herself completely. Tendai felt the gravity of her words settle over him like a storm cloud, a mixture of sorrow and compassion swelling within him. He reached for her hand, holding it tightly, offering her the warmth of his presence. She didn't pull away, instead she clung to him, her fingers cold, her grip as desperate as the confession she had shared. As they sat there, surrounded by the silence of the countryside, Tendai felt a new understanding dawn within him. He saw, in her struggle, a woman who had fought her way back from the brink, who had clawed her way out of the shadows to stand here, beside him, bruised but unbroken. There was a fierce beauty in her resilience, a strength she hadn't even realized she possessed, and in that moment he felt his own resolve strengthen. The fire crackled softly, casting dancing shadows over their faces, and he held her gaze, his expression unwavering. She had revealed to him her darkest secret, and in return he offered her the quiet promise of acceptance, a vow to carry this burden with her, to shield her from the echoes of a past she could not fully escape. They sat there, hands intertwined, the vastness of the night stretching around them like a protective shroud. In the silence that followed, Tendai knew that this revelation, this moment of raw honesty, was not just a confession, it was a step toward healing, a chance to rewrite the future they both yearned for. And as the stars emerged, bright and clear above them, he felt a flicker of hope, a fragile, tentative light guiding them both through the darkness. The tension was palpable as Tendai and Zuri walked toward the edge of the quiet town square, where the dim streetlights cast long shadows across the cobblestones. The air felt thick, electric, charged with the weight of everything left unspoken, everything that had brought them to this moment. Tendai's pulse raced, Though he kept his steps steady, his gaze fixed on the figure waiting for them beneath the glow of a single streetlight. Jonah stood with his back to them, his stance casual, hands tucked into his coat pockets as though he were merely out for an evening stroll. But Tendai recognized the deliberate nature of his posture, a subtle message of power, control. Jonah turned slowly as they approached, his face illuminated by the streetlight's cold glow, revealing a faint, knowing smile that barely touched his eyes. Tendai could feel Zuri tense beside him, her presence a tight, silent energy bracing against the storm of memories that Jonah's presence had stirred. There was an oppressive stillness in the air, as if the night itself was holding its breath waiting for what was to come. Tendai felt his anger simmering, tempered only by his need to stay steady for Zuri. Jonah's gaze flicked over them both, lingering on Zuri with a familiarity that made Tendai's skin crawl. There was no warmth, no familial bond, only a possessive, calculating coldness that marked him as a man accustomed to getting what he wanted. Jonah's presence was a stark reminder of Malik, of the world Zuri had clawed her way out of, a world that refused to let her go. Standing there facing him, Tendai understood the lengths this man would go to, the quiet threats hidden behind his smooth exterior. Jonah radiated a quiet menace, an assurance that he held all the power here, and the awareness of that control flickered in his gaze like a spark waiting to ignite. As the silence stretched on, Tendai felt Zuri shift beside him, her hand brushing his ever so slightly, a silent gesture that grounded them both, a reminder of why they were here, of what they had chosen to stand for. She lifted her chin, meeting Jonah's gaze with a defiance that surprised even Tendai, a strength that had been forged from the scars of her past. There was no need for words, he could see it in her eyes, a fierce determination that refused to bow to the shadows this man represented. Jonah's smile faded, replaced by a look of faint irritation, as if Zuri's defiance was an inconvenience, a crack in his carefully constructed plans. His gaze hardened, his mouth curling in contempt as he regarded her, a silent rebuke that sent a chill through Tendai. But Zuri held her ground, her expression unyielding, even as he took a single step toward them, closing the distance with a calculated ease. In that moment, Tendai felt the quiet fury rise within him, a protective instinct that was as fierce as it was unshakable. Jonah may have held power, influence, and connections, but Tendai held something more, the unwavering commitment to protect Zuri, to fight for the life they had struggled to reclaim. He knew that Jonah could see it too, could sense the intensity that lay just beneath the surface, and for a brief second, Tendai saw a flicker of something else in the man's eyes, uncertainty, perhaps even a hint of fear. Jonah straightened, his face a mask of cold disdain as he delivered his ultimatum, his voice low, controlled, each word laced with an unspoken threat. He claimed that Zuri's son Kofi belonged to the family legacy, that he had a right to shape the boy into Malik's image. Tendai felt a surge of anger, a primal protectiveness that clenched his fists, but he forced himself to stay calm, sensing that any show of rage would only feed Jonah's arrogance. Zuri stood tall, her eyes flashing with a determination that left no room for doubt. Tendai saw the decision in her expression, a resolve that seemed to burn brighter than the shadows that Jonah cast. It was as if in this moment she had finally chosen to let go of the fear, to confront the remnants of her past with the courage that he had always known lay within her. Jonah's face twisted into a sneer, as if disgusted by their audacity, as if the very notion of defiance was laughable. He took a step back, his gaze dark and contemptuous, his stance conveying a promise of retaliation, a vow that this confrontation was far from over. But Tendai could see that his power was beginning to wane, that Zuri's strength had unnerved him in a way he hadn't expected. Jonah's threats hung in the air, empty in the face of the quiet, unbreakable bond that Tendai and Zuri had forged. Without a word, Jonah turned on his heel, his retreat as silent and calculating as his arrival. Tendai watched as his silhouette disappeared into the shadows, his footsteps fading into the night, leaving them alone in the square. The tension broke, and Tendai felt a wave of relief flood over him, though the heaviness of the encounter still lingered, a dark residue clinging to the edges of his thoughts. Zuri exhaled a shaky breath, her shoulders relaxing as the reality of Jonah's departure settled over her. Tendai reached for her hand, intertwining his fingers with hers, a silent assurance that whatever lay ahead, they would face it together. She looked at him, her expression softened by a gratitude he could feel in every fibre of his being, a quiet understanding that their bond had become unbreakable in the face of everything they had endured. As they stood in the stillness of the town square, Tendai knew that this moment marked a turning point, a choice for freedom that they had both made, a commitment to a future untethered from the shadows of her past. The night felt lighter somehow, the air clear and fresh, as if the world itself had acknowledged the end of a long, bitter chapter. In that space of silence he felt the beginnings of peace settle within him, a fragile yet unmistakable sense that they had, at last, chosen a path that led not into the darkness but toward the light.